Before the Van der Linde gang collapses in a storm of bullets and betrayal, another nation in Red Dead's America has already fallen. Its camps are silent, its children starving, its future poisoned long before Arthur Morgan's last ride. Most riders pass it by without a second thought, galloping over the tracks and through the dust, never realizing they are crossing the grave of a people, the Wapiti Reservation. This is not just a backdrop, not just a sad corner of the map. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a nation promised freedom and given fences. In the truest sense, the Wapiti are the living embodiment of Red Dead's harshest truth, that the world was changing, and the old ways were dying. Not in a single gunfight, but over decades of quiet pressure and calculated cruelty. Long before the gang robs banks in Saint Denis or hides in the swamps of Lemoyne, the Wapiti live on fertile ancestral lands, hunting, praying, and governing themselves under leaders such as Rains Fall, from its humble beginnings as a scattered people along rivers and plains. Their story becomes entangled with a rising American state that speaks of peace while drawing new borders. Treaties are signed, then ignored. Promises are made, then twisted. Each concession carves away another piece of their world until only a barren valley remains. By the late 1800s, that valley has a name, the Wapiti Indian Reservation. It sits in the shadow of oil fields and rail lines, a cage built by pen and rifle. Colonel Henry Favours controls the rations and the medicine, withholding both to break resistance and clear the land for industrial profit. Starvation, disease, and corruption seep into every tent. This small, windswept settlement becomes a microcosm of America's darker history, where civilization claims progress while poisoning the ground beneath a starving nation. Here the great contrasts of Red Dead collide. Tradition versus progress, survival versus dignity, a peaceful philosophy of endurance embodied by Rains Fall versus the radical resistance burning in his son Eagle Flies. One father pleads for patience, one son demands justice, and both are trapped by forces far beyond their campfire. What happens when a proud people must choose between living on their knees or dying on their feet? What happens when even surrender is not enough? Into this already broken world rides a dying outlaw with a failing gang at his back. Arthur Morgan's final year intersects with the Wapiti at the precise moment the industrial rush for oil reaches their doorstep, turning their quiet suffering into open conflict. Missions, ambushes, and secret deals pull the reservation into the same spiral that consumes Dutch and his lost soul of a family, tying two tragedies together in one collapsing age. This video tells their complete chronological saga, from the Wapiti's ancestral world before the reservation, through every key treaty, mission, and betrayal, to the uncertain fate of the survivors and what their story reveals about Red Dead's America. The story begins not with the Van der Linde gang, but with the nation already living in its shadow. Rockstar hid one of its bleakest epics in plain sight. A reservation most riders pass in seconds holds a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of a nation crushed so that another nation can keep pretending it believes in freedom. This video reconstructs that entire narrative. Not just the headline missions with Arthur and Dutch, but the quiet world behind them, the missions. Side encounters, letters, campfire conversations, and environmental clues that rarely get connected into a single unbroken line. The Wapiti Reservation is not a backdrop. In the truest sense, it is the living embodiment of Red Dead's America, a place where the world was changing, the old ways were dying, and those caught in between were left to starve in the shadow of oil derricks. To understand that, the story will be rebuilt from its humble beginnings. It will start before the fences and the army wagons, when the Wapiti still lived on their ancestral lands, trading, hunting, and negotiating with a government that spoke of peace, while quietly measuring the value of their rivers and soil. From the first treaties and promises to the moment those promises are twisted into tools of confinement, the path that leads to that barren plateau will be traced step by step. How does a people go from sovereign nation to fenced independence whose food and medicine can be turned off by a single officer's signature? From there, the narrative will follow the trail all the way to its bitter end. The final acts around the oil fields, the raids on supply trains, the doomed assaults on the refinery, and the last missions where the tribe's future hangs on desperate gambles and outside help will be charted. The conclusion is not a neat epilogue. It is an ambiguous future, scattered survivors. A question, what happens to a story when civilization decides it no longer needs the people who carried it? To keep that scope clear, the structure will move chronologically through distinct phases: origins in land, dispossession and forced removal, life on the reservation under Colonel Favours, the intervention of Arthur Morgan and the Van der Linde gang, the slide into open war, and the long-term legacy that echoes into the first Red Dead Redemption. Each phase will ground the larger philosophy of the game in concrete details: rations withheld, ceremonies interrupted, graves on a hillside no longer visited. The promise here is completeness. Not only a recap of archaeology for beginners and a rage unleashed, but an attempt to fill the gaps those missions only gesture toward. What daily life on Wapiti actually looks like, who the elders and warriors are beyond the few named faces, and how every broken treaty and burned camp mirrors real United States history beat for beat. At the center stand three human anchors: Chief Rainsfall, the tired statesman trying to save a people without losing his soul; Eagle Flies, the idealistic son who cannot accept slow extinction and turns toward war; and Arthur Morgan, the outlaw who rides into a tragedy already in motion, a lost soul whose own failing body becomes a mirror for a dying nation. Their intersecting paths will guide the next chapter. Before the fences, before the army posts and ration lines, the Wapiti homeland was a wide, breathing world. It stretched across river valleys and high meadows, through elk trails and pine-shadowed ridges where the wind carried stories instead of gunfire. The reservation that players ride into is a graveyard. The land that came before was, in the truest sense, a living embodiment of Wapiti memory. The very beginning of that memory lies in the hunt. Imagine a cold dawn on those ancestral plains, elders murmuring around a low fire, young riders tightening worn saddles, a child tracing the pattern on a buffalo horn spoon, while Rainsfall's voice rolls over the camp. The elk return where they are respected, so must we. It is not just a lesson in tracking. It is a philosophy of freedom, of moving with the herds, not fencing them in. Clues to this older world are scattered through the game like half-buried artifacts: a weathered pipe bowl carved with an eagle, a ruined sweat lodge near a waterfall, prayer bundles tied to a lone tree on a ridge overlooking the oil fields that will later poison the horizon. Each object hints at a story of balance: sweat lodges for purification, rivers as sacred arteries, high cliffs as places where visions came, and the old ways were dying long before the first surveyor's stake. In this world, elders stand at the center. Men like Rainsfall carry entire generations in their voices, reciting battles, migrations, and treaties around night fires. Oral tradition is their library, their law, their history book and prophecy all at once. Children learn that land is not owned but cared for, that family extends beyond blood to clan, animal, and river. What happens when a civilization built on paper contracts collides with a nation built on spoken promises? At first, that collision wears a polite face. Early U.S. officials arrive with handshakes, medals, and flags, praising the Wapiti as noble and civilized for making peace. Treaties promise schools, food, and protection in exchange for just a portion of their hunting grounds. It sounds, on paper, from its humble beginnings, like coexistence. In practice, it is a story of slow encirclement. Those fictional documents echo real 19th century policies almost beat for beat. Manifest Destiny paints indigenous land as empty potential, indigenous people as an obstacle to be managed. Each new railroad survey, each new settler town brings another necessary cession. The logic is always the same: progress demands sacrifice, and the ones who sacrifice are never the ones writing the terms. By the time the Wapiti are pushed north toward the barren hills that will become their reservation, they are already survivors of broken promises and winter marches. Children have died on those roads. Sacred sites have been flooded, fenced, or mined. The world was changing, and every mile of that change is etched into Rainsfall's tired eyes. So when Arthur Morgan finally rides into Wapiti land, he does not meet a people at the beginning of their tragedy. He finds a nation in its last redoubt, an outlaw empire of memory holding out against erasure. The fences are up, the oil derricks are rising, and one last treaty is being twisted into a weapon. The next chapter will show what happens when a dying empire and a dying nation collide head-on, and who is left standing in the smoke. On the surface, the Wapiti story is one of signatures and stamped seals, of solemn handshakes and polished boots. Underneath, It is a story of slow strangulation, carried out in ink long before a single shot is fired. The last treaty Arthur walks into is only the final verse of a song that has been playing for decades. From its humble beginnings, each agreement is framed as protection, as partnership, as a temporary measure until the situation stabilizes. First, the Wapiti cede hunting grounds in exchange for recognition of their remaining homeland. Then river access is traded for promises of annual food shipments. Then a corridor of unused land is opened for surveyors and prospectors. Every time, the map shrinks. Every time, the language grows more careful, more technical, more lethal. What looks, on paper, like compromise is in the truest sense a slow-motion eviction. At the negotiating table, the imbalance is absolute. The documents are in English, drafted in distant offices by men who will never see the reservation except as a line on a ledger. Army officers sit nearby with rifles and sabers, a silent reminder of what happens if the pen is refused. Government agents talk about civilization, about progress, about bringing medicine in schools. In the same breath, they discuss grazing rights, rail access, and the oil that lies under Wapiti soil, already imagining derricks where lodges now stand. How free is a choice when starvation is waiting on the other side of no? The game scatters evidence of this premeditated betrayal in quiet corners. In army tents near Fort Wallace and the oil fields, letters spell out the plan, reduce rations, delay deliveries, blame administrative error until the Wapiti accept relocation. Colonel Favours is not improvising cruelty. He is following a script. Rainsfall's bitter recollections confirm it. He remembers earlier treaties that guaranteed hunting rights, only for fences and ranches to appear overnight. He remembers being told the reservation would be safe. Then watching an oil company set up just beyond its border, drills humming like an omen. This fictional machinery mirrors real policies that broke nations apart. The Dawes Act and allotment schemes took communal homelands and sliced them into individual plots, preaching self-reliance while designating all surplus land for white settlers and industry. A people who had been the living embodiment of shared territory and mutual responsibility were recast, on paper, as isolated landholders surrounded by strangers. The old ways were dying not just under gunfire, but under surveyors' chains and legal definitions. On the final treaty pages, the Wapiti are guaranteed food, medicine, and a protected reservation. It sounds humane. It sounds almost idealistic. But those guarantees become the chains. When Favours withholds rations, when medicine is lost in transit, the very promises meant to ensure survival turn into levers of control. Accept this pipeline. Accept this relocation. Accept this betrayal. Or watch the children starve. The next stage of the story will show what happens when that paper cage finally snaps, and the choice narrows to surrender or war. Those chains are not abstract. They have coordinates on a map. From the very beginning, the Wapiti Reservation is carved out as a wound in the landscape, high, cold ground where the wind never stops cutting, where the soil is thin and grudging, where the river runs low and mean through a rocky gorge. It sits beneath jagged cliffs and scattered pines, with meager fields scratched into hard earth and canvas tents flapping in the constant gusts. This is not a homeland. This is a holding pen. Look around that valley in Red Dead Redemption 2, and the pattern becomes clear. To the east and south, smokestacks and derricks rise from the oil fields, coughing black clouds into the sky. To the west, the railroad carves its iron line through the mountains, the living embodiment of a civilization that measures land in profit and timetables. The reservation is placed exactly where it needs to be, out of the way of development, yet close enough that the army can ride in within an hour. That proximity is no accident. It is a story of distance and control, of being pushed far enough to vanish from polite society, but kept near enough to be managed. The Wapiti are fenced off from fertile plains, from rich timber, from the river bottoms that once fed their families. In exchange, they are granted a patch of stone and snow within sight of the very resources stolen from them. Every gust of wind carries the smell of oil. Every distant train whistle is a reminder of what has been taken. Behind that geography stands an alliance of interests. Oil men see the valley as a corridor to wealth, a place where pipelines can snake through without legal entanglements. Colonel Favours and his officers see the Wapiti not as citizens to be protected, but as an administrative problem, an obstacle between industry and its dreams of endless extraction. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and for men in uniform and suits, that meant one thing: clear the land. So the logistics of removal become a grim routine. Wapiti families are marched or escorted under armed guard, wagons piled with what little can be carried, elders stumbling along trails that once led to hunting grounds and now end at a military checkpoint. Graves are left behind on hills that will soon overlook pump jacks. Sacred sites vanish behind fences and survey stakes. Who remembers a stone circle when the company ledger calls it Parcel 7B? There is a cruel irony here, in the truest sense. The reservation is justified as protection, as a benevolent refuge from the encroaching world, even as food is withheld and medicine delayed to coerce signatures and compliance. Freedom is promised on paper while the horizon shrinks to a ring of cliffs and patrol routes. This is not from its humble beginnings a village that grew where a people chose to stay. It is a warehouse for a nation that has been told there is nowhere else to go. So when the player first rides into Wapiti, the scene is not of a thriving traditional community, but of a people stored on the edge of an empire, waiting for the next blow. Tents sag, children cough, warriors watch the ridgelines where soldiers will soon appear. The reservation is not the end of the story, only the staging ground for the final confrontation between survival, resistance, and a civilization that refuses to stop advancing. The reservation is the stage. Colonel Henry Favours is the director of its misery. In a story of conquest that hides behind signatures and stamps, he becomes the living embodiment of the U.S. Army's policy at Wapiti. Polite in reports, brutal in effect, and always in step with the men drilling for oil beyond the hills. On paper, Favours is by the book, a disciplined officer maintaining order on a difficult frontier. In practice, his book is written by industrialists and politicians, who see the Wapiti not as a nation, but as an obstacle. He attends dinners with oil executives, trades letters with senators, and speaks the language of progress and civilization while the world was changing around the people he is starving. From its humble beginnings, the reservation was never meant to sustain life. Under Favours, it becomes a slow, deliberate weapon. Food rations promised by treaty arrive late or not at all. Crates sit in army depots while children on the ridge chew on boiled roots. When rains fall petitions for more flour, more meat, Favours answers with paperwork, missing forms, incorrect seals, new regulations. A chief who once fed his people from rivers and herds now waits on a quartermaster's whim. The old ways were dying, and Favours makes sure the new ways come with hunger. The same pattern governs medicine. Fever spreads through the tents, coughs deepen, and the elders plead for doctors. The army has vaccines, the army has supplies, yet Favours delays the mission, then narrows it, then sends it under guard as if charity were treason. In one overheard conversation, soldiers admit the truth. The suffering is not an accident of distance or weather. It is pressure. It is policy. One man jokes that starving people complain less when the oil derricks go up. Another shrugs that orders are orders. The irony is quiet and cruel. Men who never fired a shot at the Wapiti do more damage with a missing shipment than with a rifle. This silent war tears at the Wapiti from the inside. Parents watch their children weaken and can offer only thin broth and whispered stories of better seasons. Elders lose authority because their wisdom cannot conjure bread from barren soil. Every delay from the fort sounds, to young ears, like betrayal. Patience begins to look like surrender. How long can a people endure humiliation before resistance feels, in the truest sense, like the only path to freedom? Favours counts on that anger. A starving, desperate nation is easier to provoke, easier to label as hostile, easier to remove. His philosophy is simple: starve them, sicken them, then blame them when they finally strike back. This is the quiet prelude to the louder chapters of Red Dead Redemption 2. Because while the Wapiti endure this long siege, a different outlaw family is riding unknowingly toward them. Arthur Morgan, a lost soul in a gang chasing its own dreams and delusions, is about to stumble into a conflict that has been burning for years, and the collision will change both stories forever. Arthur's arrival at Wapiti does not begin with a battle cry, but with a quiet conversation in a sick man's tent. The story of this reservation and of what it will become runs straight through two people: a weary father and a furious son. Rains Fall is the first true center of that story. From its humble beginnings, his leadership was built on ceremony, patience, and the belief that a nation survives by remembering what it is, even when the world is changing around it. He has watched treaties written and erased, promises signed and broken, families marched from green valleys to barren rock. The very beginning of his philosophy is simple: live long enough that the children and grandchildren of the Wapiti can inherit something more than graves. So he walks gently. He gathers herbs for Arthur's medicine, speaks of eagles and wolves, of balance and consequence. Around a small fire, he tells Arthur that war is not glory, but hunger, disease, and dead sons. To Arthur, a man drowning in his own outlaw life, this old chief becomes the living embodiment of a different kind of strength, a strength that chooses endurance over revenge. Eagle Flies has no patience for that endurance. He has grown up with no memory of open hunting grounds, only of ration lines and soldiers aiming rifles at children. Where his father remembers rivers and buffalo, Eagle Flies remembers Colonel Favours withholding food, poisoning water, and laughing at petitions. For him, civilization is not a promise but a boot on his neck. Why speak of peace to men who only understand bullets? Their conflict is not just personal, it is generational in the truest sense. In countless oppressed communities, elders carry stories of a wider world, while the young inherit only fences, curfews, and rage. Rainsfall still believes in letters to Washington, in witnesses, in buying time. Eagle Flies believes time has already been stolen. He sees Arthur and the Van der Linde gang as proof that force can bend the world, that an idealistic charge against the fort might finally shatter this cage. Arthur stands between them, listening as Rainsfall warns that every act of violence will bring 10 more in return, while Eagle Flies seethes at each new humiliation from Favours. A stolen horses raid, a sabotaged train, the fort assault, each step is a choice between his father's restraint and his own desperate need to strike back. Is survival worth the taste of constant defeat? Is freedom real if it is only endured in silence? That tension becomes the hinge of the Wapiti's fate. Endure and risk quiet erasure. Strike back and invite explosive tragedy. As Arthur's cough worsens and Dutch's delusions grow, the space between Rainsfall's patience and Eagle Fly's fury will close, and when it does, the reservation will stop being a prison and become a battlefield. The next move, one reckless decision, will decide whose philosophy writes the final chapter. The reservation becomes real the moment the horse slows and the coughing starts. Not gunfire, not speeches, just the thin rasp of lungs that have breathed too much dust and too little hope. This is not a battlefield yet, it is a camp in slow-motion collapse, a story of a nation being starved instead of shot. From its humble beginnings as a proud roaming people, the Wapiti have been pushed into this cramped basin of canvas and smoke. Arthur rides through narrow paths where tents sag under their own weight, hides patched and repatched until the seams look older than the faces inside. Cooking fires burn low, not for stealth, but because there is almost nothing left to burn and even less to cook. A single pot simmers over gray coals, and the smell is not rich stew, but thin broth and desperation. Everywhere the body tells the truth that Favours reports hide. Children with swollen bellies and stick-thin arms wander past, their eyes huge and skull-like faces. Men and women sit wrapped in threadbare blankets though the sun is high, shivering with fevers the army's withheld medicine could have treated. Coughs tear through the air in rough, wet bursts, answered by the soft murmur of exhausted caretakers. No exposition is needed. The cracked lips, the hollow cheeks, the way people move carefully to save strength, all reveal the cost of a philosophy that values oil more than oxygen. Yet the camp is not only misery. In the truest sense, it is also resistance. Near the edge of the tents stands a small prayer site, stones carefully arranged. Offerings of herbs and feathers laid out with reverence. Ceremonial pipes, beadwork, and painted drums sit beside bedrolls and empty crates, the living embodiment of a culture refusing to vanish quietly. An elder whispers a prayer over a bowl of smoke. A young woman braids another's hair in traditional patterns. A child repeats old stories in a language the government would prefer to forget. The world was changing. The old ways were dying. But they are not dead yet. Arthur's presence moves through this space like a question. Elders look at him with wary calculation, measuring an outlaw whose face carries both guilt and a growing cough of his own. Women watch him with guarded curiosity, grateful for the medicine and food he brings, yet fully aware that the gang beside him survives on the same collapsing frontier that is killing them. The young warriors, Eagle Flies' peers, study him with a simmering mix of anger and admiration, wondering if this ragged gunslinger proves that violence is the only language civilization understands. The emotional tone of the camp is layered, resignation in the slumped shoulders, quiet grief in the songs murmured at dusk, and beneath it all a banked fury waiting for a spark. Every sick body, every empty pot, every prayer, whispered over a dying child, presses in on Arthur as his own illness advances. This is not set dressing. It is a mirror. One dying man walking through a dying nation, both trapped between dreams of freedom and the reality of betrayal, both running out of time before the shooting starts. The next turning point arrives quietly, almost politely, in a world that has forgotten how to be gentle. As Arthur rides north from the gang's rotten hole at Beaver Hollow, the fever in his lungs rising with the altitude. Another crisis is reaching its limit. The Van der Linde family is splintering under Dutch's paranoia and Micah's poison, and far above the oil fields, the Wapiti have reached their own breaking point under Colonel Favours' slow, bureaucratic cruelty. By the time Arthur truly meets Rain's Fall, both men are already standing on the edge. Dutch's grand philosophy has curdled into delusions of one last score. Favours has turned treaty obligations into weapons, starving a nation to clear land for industrial dreams. Into this convergence rides a tired outlaw sent to make contact, a man who has spent a lifetime taking from the world, now walking into a camp where everything has already been taken. The first real encounter is not framed by drawn guns or shouted threats. It begins with water, herbs, and quiet. Rain's Fall sits in his tent, surrounded by medicines and ceremonial objects that the army would call trinkets, and the Wapiti call sacred. His posture is calm, his voice soft, but the lines on his face carry years of betrayal. Here stands a chief who has watched the old ways dying, forced to bargain with men who see his people as an obstacle rather than a nation. Arthur enters as the living embodiment of another dying order, the romantic outlaw myth that Dutch still preaches. He is dirty, coughing, carrying the weight of robberies, train jobs, and shootouts. Yet, Rain's Fall reads him in an instant. He sees the hesitation before Arthur speaks, the way his eyes lower at the sight of sick children, the way his shoulders sag when the chief mentions broken promises. This is not the swaggering gunman Favours imagines. This is a lost soul, worn thin by a story of freedom that never truly belonged to him. So why does Rain's Fall trust him, even a little? Because he understands that desperation makes strange allies. Because in Arthur's silence he hears shame rather than arrogance. And because, in the truest sense, he has run out of choices. Turning this stranger away changes nothing. Asking him for help might save a few lives, or at least buy a little more time. The tasks he offers are a quiet rebellion against Arthur's past. No bank vaults, no stagecoaches, no piles of cash. Instead, retrieving stolen sacred items from a military wagon, gathering herbs for medicine, riding to diffuse his son's anger before it explodes. Protection instead of plunder. Restoration instead of destruction. Respect instead of conquest. For a man raised to believe that survival demands violence, what does it mean to be asked to guard rather than to take? From its humble beginnings, this meeting could be mistaken for a side quest, a detour from the gang's collapse. It is not. It is the hinge. In helping the Wapiti, Arthur begins to see that some stories cannot be outrun, only faced, and the fate closing in on their reservation is a mirror of the fate closing in on him. As the conflict with Favours intensifies, that mirror will only grow sharper, until Dutch's war and Rain's Fall's warnings collide in open bloodshed. The hinge turns quietly. No gunfight, no dynamite, no grand Van der Linde philosophy shouted over gunsmoke. It begins with an old man asking for help, and with Arthur Morgan agreeing to a mission that, on paper, barely looks like an outlaw job at all. Rain's Fall comes to Arthur not as a client or a co-conspirator, but as a father trying to protect what is left of a dying nation. The army has raided sacred burial grounds, stealing ceremonial items and medicine bundles, treating graves as obstacles rather than holy places. For Rain's Fall, this is not about property or profit. It is, in the truest sense, about spiritual survival, about whether a people stripped of land and food will also be stripped of memory. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, And these artifacts are the last threads tying the Wapiti to ancestors the government has already tried to erase. So Arthur rides out under a different banner. No Dutch, no grand speech, no promise of freedom through violence. His task is simple and strangely gentle: infiltrate an army camp, find what was taken, and leave without bloodshed. The plan demands stealth, observation, and restraint, three things the Van der Linde gang rarely prizes when there is money on the table. Here, the reward is intangible, and yet it carries more weight than any bank vault. The infiltration itself feels almost alien beside the gang's usual chaos. Arthur scouts the perimeter, watches patrol patterns, and moves through tents and wagons with the wary patience of a man who knows that one dead soldier could doom an entire tribe. The player is pushed to avoid gunfire, to slip past sentries rather than cut them down, to treat the camp not as a target, but as hostile terrain that must be crossed without leaving a mark. It is a story of trespass and repair, not conquest. Pacing slows. The soundscape changes. There is no triumphant music, no roaring getaway. The focus lingers on the objects themselves, bundles wrapped with care, carved pieces, worn smooth by generations. The living embodiment of a culture that has been herded onto barren rock, so that oilmen and officers can congratulate themselves on civilization. Where earlier missions revel in the rush of the score, this one dwells on desecration, on the quiet horror of graves torn open for trophies. Arthur's attitude shifts with that tone. He handles the artifacts with an almost awkward reverence, as if aware his rough hands have broken too many things already. When he returns them, he does not boast. He listens. Rain's Fall tells stories of treaties broken, of forced marches, of how freedom was traded away for empty promises and poisoned rations. Arthur, a veteran of Dutch's delusions, hears an older, darker version of the same pattern: dreams offered, loyalty exploited, betrayal inevitable. There is a subtle shame in his silence, a recognition that he has ridden with the same army that now starves these people. By the end of Archaeology for Beginners, two seeds are buried. One is the bond between Arthur and the Wapiti, a connection built not on shared violence but on shared grief and respect. The other is suspicion. The army knows someone slipped into their camp, someone clever enough to leave no bodies and yet make them look weak. How long before Colonel Favours decides that weakness demands a brutal answer, and that Dutch's gang is the perfect tool or scapegoat to provide it? Colonel Favours feels that weakness in his bones, and he hates it. Because just beyond his parade ground, beyond the thin line of tents and starving families, the real power in this corner of the world is already rising from the earth. To the south and west of the reservation, the land does not look sacred or protected. It looks exploited. Smoking derricks claw at the sky, wooden towers creaking as they pull black oil from deep underground. Pipelines snake across the hills, cutting through old hunting paths, turning what was once a living landscape into a grid of profit and control. Company men ride in clean coats and polished boots, their ledgers as deadly as any rifle, measuring every barrel, every dollar, every delay. In the truest sense, this is the living embodiment of what Dutch has been preaching about from the very beginning: civilization as conquest, progress as a noose. The Wapiti Reservation sits in the middle of a battlefield that does not look like a battlefield at all. It looks like contracts, survey flags, and surveyors guarded by soldiers. The oil company wants a clear field. Favours wants promotion and influence. The Wapiti are in the way. Their alliance is simple, almost insultingly so. The army clears resistance, the company exploits the land, and both profit while the Wapiti starve. Favours withholds food and medicine, delays supplies, and calls it discipline. The company calls it efficiency. Hunger becomes a weapon, disease a negotiation tactic. If the Wapiti move quietly, they are cooperating. If they assert treaty rights, if they protest, if they simply refuse to vanish, they become insubordinate. And insubordination, to men like Favours, must be crushed. This is not just a story of one corrupt officer and one greedy corporation. It is a story of a system that has decided that land is only valuable when it can be burned. Oil is fuel for factories, for trains, for an industrial future that promises order and profit. A people tied to that land, whose dreams and memories run through its rivers and valleys, are treated as an obstacle, an accounting problem, a delay to be removed. Here, the irony cuts deep. Dutch rails against these forces, against railroads and oil and the men in suits who buy the world piece by piece. He sees the Wapiti as proof that the old ways were dying, that the government is nothing but betrayal and violence dressed up as law. Yet even as he condemns Favours and the company, he cannot resist turning their struggle into another scheme, another chance to strike back and prove his philosophy right. From its humble beginnings, the Van der Linde gang claimed to fight for freedom against civilization. Now that rhetoric collides with a nation on the brink of erasure. The coming conflict at the reservation is not a random skirmish or a tragic misunderstanding. It is the inevitable collision between a people rooted in the land and a machine that sees that same land only as fuel. And once that machine starts turning, who can stand in front of it without being ground under? The machine does not just crush nations, it forges radicals in its gears. Eagle Flies is one of them. His path from impatient son to hardened insurgent is a story of anger inherited, tested, and finally weaponized. From the very beginning, his clashes with Rainsfall are framed as more than a family argument. They are a generational fault line. Rainsfall brings petitions to Washington, stacks of letters and promises, the language of civilization and compromise. Eagle Flies brings only contempt for those papers, for those meetings where white men nod, smile, and send nothing. To him, every polite conversation is another winter of hunger. Every empty word is a quiet betrayal. The reservation turns that contempt into conviction. Eagle Flies watches soldiers beat elders for crossing invisible boundaries on land that was once theirs in the truest sense. He sees young men dragged away in chains after protesting withheld rations. There are children with sunken cheeks, mothers boiling leather when the flower wagons do not arrive. Each indignity is a lesson, and the lesson is simple: the army understands force, and only force. Rockstar does not leave this as vague background. It becomes personal. When Colonel Favours has Wapiti men arrested on trumped-up charges, Eagle Flies is there, powerless, as their families scream. When the tribe's horses are seized, he feels not just economic loss, but a spiritual amputation. The old ways were dying, and the men killing them wore uniforms and carried flags. What philosophy of patience could answer that? Into this pressure cooker walks Arthur Morgan, an outlaw whose own world is collapsing. Their interactions are tense, almost mirror images. Eagle Flies admires Arthur's willingness to ride into danger, to steal back horses, to break prisoners out of Fort Wallace. Here, finally, is a white man who acts instead of talks, yet there is suspicion in every glance. Can a man who serves Dutch's shifting dreams truly be an ally, or is he just another passing storm? Eagle Flies wants an accomplice, not a counselor. So when Arthur hesitates, when he echoes Rainsfall's warnings or questions the cost of blood, disappointment cuts deep. To Eagle Flies, restraint looks like surrender. To Arthur, who is beginning to see the ruins left by Dutch's philosophy, Eagle Flies is the living embodiment of a younger, more idealistic self rushing toward the same cliff. In that sense, Eagle Flies stands beside real figures from indigenous resistance, men like Crazy Horse or Sitting Bull, whose youth was spent in a free world and whose adulthood was spent watching it fenced, mined, and surveyed. Rockstar condenses a century of generational rage into one character, from its humble beginnings in childhood stories of freedom to the final frantic charge against an empire. And just when his anger needs a language, Dutch van der Linde arrives. Dutch speaks of resistance, of destiny, of fighting back against the government's lies. For Eagle Flies, it is intoxicating, empowering, fatal. The next time the machine turns, he will not just be ground under it, he will throw himself into its cogs. Dutch arrives at Wapiti not as a savior, but as a man running out of road. The gang has staggered from Blackwater to St. Denis to Beaver Hollow, shedding money, friends, and illusions at every turn, and Dutch feels the walls closing in. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and his grand philosophy of freedom through outlawry is starting to look less like a code and more like a delusion. In this moment of desperation, the reservation becomes useful. Dutch sees the cracked earth, the sick children, the empty food stores deliberately withheld by Colonel Favours, and he does feel anger. Yet even from the very beginning, that anger is filtered through his own story. To Dutch, the Wapiti are not just a starving nation, they are evidence. Proof that civilization is a lie, that the government is a machine built to crush the weak and reward the rich. Their suffering slots neatly into his speeches about progress and betrayal. Where Arthur sees gaunt faces and quiet dignity, Dutch sees an audience, a stage, a new cause that might turn his failing gang into the living embodiment of resistance one last time. He strides into Rainsfall's tent with rhetoric honed over decades. The government is corrupt, the treaties are worthless, the men who drill for oil are parasites. It is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family and nations discarded when they are no longer convenient. But Rainsfall is cautious, weary, too old to be seduced by fire alone. It is Eagle Flies who listens with shining eyes. Dutch positions himself to the young warrior as a fellow revolutionary in the truest sense. A man who has fought the law from its humble beginnings in the back alleys to full-scale battles with Pinkertons and bankers. He promises weapons, tactics, and the kind of boldness that will humiliate the army and drive the oilmen from their land. All he asks in return is the chance to strike first. Arthur stands nearby, listening. He hears the same rhythms that once inspired him as a boy, the same talk of freedom and destiny, but now there is a hollow ring beneath the poetry. When Dutch speaks of our people, Arthur notices how easily the phrase stretches to cover whoever is useful that week. To Arthur, the Wapiti are not a symbol. They are neighbors, families, every lost soul the gang has ever failed to protect. This is where the split inside the Van der Linde gang stops being theoretical. Dutch delivers fiery speeches about nations rising, about history bending under the weight of brave men with guns. Arthur worries about medicine, about food, about what happens to these people after the shooting stops. One man is planning a war, the other is counting the bodies that will fall in it. Dutch's involvement turns a slow strangulation into a fuse. Colonel Favours still controls the rations and the rifles, but now there is a reckless outlaw prophet whispering in Eagle Flies' ear, promising glory in the smoke of burning wagons. The reservation, once a quiet graveyard of broken treaties, is about to become a battlefield. And the first shot has not even been fired yet. Favours controls the rations and the rifles, but the mission that bears his name reveals something far uglier. He also controls the rules. Favours for Favours is not just a quest marker. It is a story of how power launders theft into policy, how a uniform turns private greed into public duty. The premise is simple on the surface. Dutch sends Arthur and Eagle Flies to interfere in local politics and military logistics, to weaken Colonel Henry Favours and gain leverage over the army camped beside the Wapiti's dying homeland. But from the very beginning, the plan is rooted in corruption already in motion. The gang is not inventing rot. It is stepping into a world where the old ways were dying under ledgers, signatures, and backroom deals. Arthur's first task is almost absurd in its irony, stealing a wagon full of army ballots to manipulate an election that has already been bought. The supposed democratic process becomes cargo to be hijacked, traded, and threatened over. In the truest sense, the mission turns politics into contraband, showing that the outcome was never about justice, only about which powerful man could squeeze more out of the land. As Arthur infiltrates the army camp with Monroe's help, the camera lingers on Favours' quiet meetings with oil representatives and government men. There are no grand speeches about civilization, only clipped exchanges about drilling rights, supply contracts, and how inconvenient the Wapiti presence has become. A colonel of the United States Army accepts bribes in the form of promised promotions and lucrative futures, and in return he bends or breaks every regulation meant to protect the tribe. Rations are cut, medical supplies vanish, patrols accidentally trespass deeper into sacred ground. Arthur's errands expose the machinery behind this. Sabotaging supply lines, stealing documents, blackmailing quartermasters who skim off the top. Each task peels back another layer. The corruption is not a single villain. It is a chain. Quartermasters profit from shortages. Politicians trade the Wapiti's survival for votes. Industrialists turn rivers and hills into numbers on a balance sheet. The reservation becomes the living embodiment of a philosophy that values oil and order over people and freedom. Yet the more Arthur helps, the less righteous it feels. He forges letters, threatens officials, and derails Favours' plans. But every victory is conditional, temporary. Already hemmed in by a system designed to replace one corrupt officer with another. How much can an outlaw do when the law itself is the crime? Even as he rides beside Eagle Flies, there is a growing sense that he is only shifting the weight of a boot that will never lift. By the end of Favours for Favours, the legal and political routes are exposed as theater. Appeals to Washington go unanswered. Honest officers like Monroe are punished, exiled, erased. For the Wapiti, there is no courtroom left to enter, no petition left to file. In that vacuum, Eagle Fly's call to arms stops sounding reckless and starts sounding inevitable, the next desperate chapter in a story that has already closed every other door. In that vacuum, the next blow does not come from a rifle or a saber. It comes from a locked crate on the back of a government wagon. A story of conquest in the 19th century is also a story of germs, of blankets and rations and clerical errors that just happened to arrive too late. On the Wapiti Reservation, disease is not a rumor. It is everywhere. Arthur hears about it first in whispers: children burning with fever, old women coughing blood. Rainsfall explains that medical supplies, promised in treaties and paid for with land and dignity, are being delayed at the fort. Colonel Favours signs the papers, the army draws the pay, and then the wagons quietly turn away from the reservation. From its humble beginnings as bureaucratic neglect, the policy has become the living embodiment of slow violence. When Captain Monroe risks his career to reveal that a shipment of vaccines is being diverted, the choice laid before Arthur is no simple robbery. Intercept the wagon, or watch more Wapiti die. For an outlaw who has spent a lifetime taking from the world, the idea of stealing something to give it away feels almost absurd. Two men trying to rob each other is one thing. Robbing the state to save children is something else entirely. The heist itself is tense, stripped of glamour. Arthur and Monroe ride out to a lonely stretch of road, waiting for the rattle of wheels and the glint of army steel. The ambush is quick but brutal. Horses spook, guards shout, gunfire cracks through the dust. Arthur moves with practiced efficiency, but the stakes are different now. Every bullet he fires is weighed against a sick child's breath. Every second the wagon rolls forward is another heartbeat lost back on the reservation. When the shooting stops, the real prize is not cash or bonds, but wooden crates marked with medical seals. Arthur forces them open and finds vials and instruments instead of banknotes. In that moment, the game's philosophy becomes painfully clear. Disease on the reservation is not misfortune. It is policy. It is the predictable result of withholding aid until a people either surrender their land or perish. For Arthur, already coughing into his own handkerchief, this mission lands with a cruel symmetry. He is a dying man stealing life. In the truest sense, this is one of the few times he risks everything for no promise of profit, no dream of freedom, only the hope that strangers' children might see another winter. A lost soul, briefly, does something undeniably right. The vaccines reach the Wapiti and bring short-term relief, but the cost is immediate. Favours sees the theft as open defiance. The army hardens its posture, patrols tighten, and Monroe's fate is sealed. The old ways were dying, and with them any illusion of compromise. Each crate of stolen medicine becomes another step toward open war, pushing Favours toward retaliation and Eagle Flies toward the point of no return. Each stolen crate of medicine is a reprieve, but also a warning. The army's patience, already thin, begins to tear. The story shifts from tense standoff to something harsher, and the next insult makes sure there's no turning back. Colonel Favours answers the theft not with dialogue, but with humiliation. A Wapiti scouting party is harassed, beaten, and dragged into camp. Others are fired on near the oil fields, their presence treated as trespass on land that was theirs from the very beginning. Soldiers ride through the reservation with open contempt, brandishing weapons, taunting starving families. One more elder is struck with a rifle butt. One more young man is left bleeding in the dust. For Eagle Flies, already pushed to the edge, this is proof that petitions are a dead language in a world ruled by force. So the philosophy changes. If the army respects only violence, then violence is what they will receive. Eagle Flies calls for action against the oil facilities and the supply lines feeding them, a story of resistance born in desperation rather than conquest. Dutch van der Linde, hearing this, does not hesitate. Where Rainsfall sees annihilation, Dutch sees opportunity, a righteous cause, a new banner to wrap around his outlaw dreams of freedom and revenge. Planning the attack becomes a strange alliance. Around the fire, Wapiti warriors speak of sacred ground and broken treaties, while Dutch sketches routes, guard rotations, and dynamite placements with almost boyish enthusiasm. Arthur listens, watching Eagle Fly's eyes burn with conviction and Dutch's with something colder. The target is clear: strike the refinery and the army assets around it, cripple Favours' operation, send a message that the old ways were dying, but not quietly. The raid itself is chaos wrapped in exhilaration. Under cover of darkness, riders sweep in, torches flare, and gunfire cracks against the metal skeletons of industry. Oil tanks erupt in plumes of fire, black smoke clawing at the sky as if the land itself is screaming. For a moment, it feels in the truest sense like justice, the oppressed striking back, the living embodiment of every broken promise finally answered. Yet even as Eagle flies whoops in triumph and Dutch laughs through the gunpowder haze, Arthur sees something else. He sees thin bodies, worn rifles, and an enemy that can replace every dead soldier 10 times over. He fights alongside them, but his thoughts are elsewhere. Is Dutch protecting these people, or feeding them into the gears of his own delusions? Each explosion is a victory and a sentence, a signal flare inviting retribution from a civilization that has never shown mercy to those in its path. Arthur's loyalty pulls him forward, his conscience drags him back. When the flames die down, the line is clear. No more envoys, no more letters, no more Monroe standing helpless in the middle. The Wapiti are now at war with the United States Army, and everyone present knows what that usually means. The world was changing, but not in their favor. The only question is how much more the army will take from them in response, and who Dutch intends to sacrifice when that response finally comes. The war at the reservation begins with gunfire and orders, but the deeper conflict is quieter, slower, and far more merciless. It is a story of 2 illnesses unfolding in tandem, one in a single man's lungs, and one in an entire people's homeland. Arthur's tuberculosis diagnosis arrives almost offhandedly. In a doctor's cramped office in Saint Denis, yet from the very beginning it rewrites his understanding of time. The outlaw who once rode from score to score, certain that tomorrow would always bring another job, another dawn, suddenly finds that tomorrow is no longer promised. Every cough becomes a reminder, every dizzy spell an unwelcome clock. The life he built on Dutch's philosophy of freedom above all else now shows its cost in blood on a handkerchief. That blood matters at Wapiti. When Arthur first walks through the reservation after his diagnosis, the camp mirrors his own failing body. Tents sag, fires burn low, and the people move with a weary slowness that has nothing to do with age. Children cough in the background. Elders lie under thin blankets, eyes glazed with fever. The visible suffering in the Wapiti camp turns disease into a shared language of decline, his hacking breath, their hollow faces, one rhythm of exhaustion. This parallel is not subtle. Arthur's cough grows harsher as the Wapiti's food rations shrink. His strength wanes as Colonel Favours withholds medicine and blankets. He is an outlaw used to seeing wounds from bullets and knives, but here the wounds are invisible, inflicted by treaties, signatures, and deliberate neglect. In the truest sense, the reservation is the living embodiment of his own prognosis. Both are being consumed from the inside by forces they cannot simply shoot. As his body fails, Arthur's empathy deepens. Once, the gang's problems were all that mattered. Now, kneeling beside Wapiti sickbeds, he recognizes something that goes beyond injustice. He sees fellow travelers on a road with no return, people who also watched the world changing and found themselves left behind. He sees not just victims of civilization's advance, but reflections of his own wasted years. The trail of bodies and broken promises that followed the gang from its humble beginnings. That is why the quiet scenes with Rain's Fall matter so much. Arthur helps gather herbs along the river, listens as the chief explains which plants cool fever and which ease pain. He assists in simple rituals, bringing water, tending fires, standing in respectful silence. For a man raised on Dutch's rhetoric, on the belief that guns and speeches could bend the world, this is a revelation. Here is another philosophy of survival, one that does not promise grand freedom or golden futures. Only a chance to endure the day without losing one's soul. There is even a bitter irony. The civilization that made Arthur sick dismisses Rains Fall's knowledge as primitive. Yet it is the only medicine that offers him any comfort. Who really understands this dying land? The colonel with his ledgers, or the chief with his herbs? By the time Arthur accepts that his end is near, his moral awakening is inseparable from his time at Wapiti. Their tragedy forces him to confront what kind of man he wants to be in his final weeks, another instrument of betrayal, or someone who finally chooses loyalty to those the world has decided to erase. The old ways were dying, but in helping the Wapiti, Arthur begins, at last, to die on his own terms. The question is whether Dutch, staring at the same reservation, will learn anything at all. Dutch does not learn. He doubles down. Standing on the edge of the Wapiti camp, with the reservation sick and starving behind him and the oil fields belching smoke in the distance, he finds not a warning, but a stage. For a man who once preached freedom from its humble beginnings in backroom saloons and campfires, this is the grand theater he has been craving. To Eagle Flies and the gang, Dutch cast their intervention as a story of resistance against civilization's worst excesses. He speaks of tyranny, of government betrayal, of industrial greed poisoning the world. Helping the Wapiti, he insists, is not just charity, but the living embodiment of the gang's philosophy. They are not mere outlaws, they are revolutionaries, striking back for all the broken promises written in Washington ink and washed away in stolen blood. The speeches are stirring, the reality is cruel. Dutch pushes Eagle Flies toward raids on supply wagons and assaults on military convoys that are tactically dramatic but strategically suicidal. He is willing to risk Wapiti lives for explosions and headlines, but offers no concrete path for their long-term safety, no plan for food through winter, no escape route when the army inevitably responds. When the ambushes go wrong, when men fall and the noose tightens, Dutch is suddenly elsewhere. He vanishes into the trees, into Saint Denis, into the next scheme. In contrast, Arthur moves in the opposite direction, away from the grand gesture and toward the quiet duty. While Dutch talks of destiny, Arthur brings medicine. While Dutch promises glory, Arthur stands guard over wagons and listens to Rainsfall's stories of a world that once was. One man needs the Wapiti as symbols in his crumbling myth. The other begins to see them, in the truest sense, as people trying to survive as the old ways were dying. This divide becomes clearest whenever Rainsfall urges caution. The elder chief, exhausted by decades of betrayal, begs Dutch to avoid open war, to think of the children and the sick, to accept that survival may mean retreat. Dutch brushes him aside, drawn instead to the fiery zeal of Eagle Flies. The son offers what Dutch now craves: passion, certainty, an echo of the young idealist he once imagined himself to be. Is it any surprise which voice he chooses to hear? By this point, Dutch is no longer fighting for the Wapiti at all. He is fighting for a version of himself that died long before Blackwater, chasing the ghost of a philosophy that cannot exist in this world. The reservation becomes his final stage, the Wapiti his final props. The tragedy is that when the curtain falls, they are the ones left bleeding in the dust, and as the army closes in and the oil wells keep turning, the question hangs over every choice that follows: who is truly being liberated here, and who is simply being used, one last time, by a lost soul who cannot admit the story is over? The answer arrives in gunpowder. If the reservation is Dutch's final stage, then the assault on the army fort is the moment the play turns from tragedy into catastrophe. From its humble beginnings as a desperate plea for food and medicine, the Wapiti struggle is twisted into a full-scale act of war, and Eagle Flies steps forward as the living embodiment of that turn. Dutch feeds him a philosophy dressed up as salvation. The fort, Dutch insists, is the key. Seize the weapons, seize the supplies, and suddenly this is no longer a story of quiet starvation, but of armed resistance. In the truest sense, Eagle Flies wants freedom for his people. Dutch wants a distraction, a spectacle, a chance to strike at the civilization he blames for every failure. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Dutch convinces Eagle Flies that bold violence is the only language the Empire still understands. So they ride, Wapiti warriors on tough, underfed ponies, Von der Linde outlaws with worn saddles and loaded rifles, a makeshift alliance charging towards stone walls and Gatling guns. Arthur is there, Charles is there, gang members and tribesmen sharing nervous glances that say what no one dares to speak. Is this bravery, or is this suicide? The attack hits the fort like a thunderclap. Explosions tear at the outer defenses as Dutch's men plant dynamite, gunfire rips through the dust, and Wapiti fighters rush the breach with spears and old carbines against repeating rifles and artillery. Smoke rolls across the yard, soldiers shout orders, and in the chaos a strange irony plays out. Outlaws and savages, the Empire's favorite monsters, are suddenly fighting shoulder to shoulder, dying in the same dirt. Again and again, Arthur is forced into choices that cut against Dutch's orders. Dutch screams to push forward, to press the advantage, to leave no survivors. Arthur sees Wapiti warriors pinned under machine gun fire and peels off to drag them to cover. Dutch demands they chase fleeing soldiers into open ground. Arthur instead covers the retreat, buying seconds that mean the difference between escape and slaughter. Each moment widens the crack between loyalty to Dutch and loyalty to the people Dutch claims to be helping. When the smoke finally clears, the imbalance is undeniable. Many Wapiti lie dead or dying, their best young fighters spent in a single, desperate gamble. The fort, battered but intact, calls in reinforcements by telegraph. Colonel Favours, who has been starving the reservation into submission, now has exactly what he needs: a rebellion to crush. He files reports framing the attack as unprovoked savagery, proof that harsher measures are not only justified but necessary. Tactically, the assault gains almost nothing: a few crates of rifles, a brief sting to the army's pride, a fleeting sense that the empire can bleed. Strategically, it gives that empire the excuse it has been waiting for to move from slow strangulation to open extermination. And as Dutch calls it a victory and eagle flies taste blood and grief in the same breath, the question becomes unavoidable. What will the army do now that it is free to drop the mask? The answer comes quickly. Not as a letter, not as a speech, but as troop movements, supply wagons, and whispered orders. The army calls the fort raid a provocation. Rainsfall calls it what it is: a disaster. He stands in the shadow of that choice, watching wounded Wapiti carried back to a reservation already starved of food and hope. The old chief is not blind to bravery, but he is not fooled by Dutch's talk of victory either. In the truest sense, he sees two empires at work: the empire of the United States and the smaller, collapsing kingdom of Dutch's ego. Both are willing to spend his people's blood. Both pretend it is for freedom. His first reaction is grief. His second is anger, not at his son, whose rage has been carefully cultivated by years of humiliation and broken treaties, but at the outlaw who promised clever schemes and delivered open war. Dutch spoke of philosophy, of resistance, of striking back at a rigged civilization. Rainsfall hears only the echoes of every white politician who promised justice, then sent soldiers instead. So he does the only thing he can still control: he tries to slow the killing. While Eagle Flies dreams of more raids, Rainsfall turns to paper and words. He dictates letters to distant officials, to senators who have never set foot on the reservation, to agents in Washington who file his pleas under inconvenient. Emissaries ride out with messages asking for negotiation, for time, for the simple dignity of being heard. The replies, when they come at all, are delays wrapped in politeness. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and bureaucracy kills far more quietly than bullets. Here the story narrows, focusing on quiet conversations rather than gunfire. Arthur rides with Rainsfall to collect herbs for medicine, to visit sacred sites already scarred by survey stakes and oil derricks. Around the campfire, the chief speaks softly of the cost of war, of how leadership means choosing who lives with hunger and who dies in battle. He admits his greatest fear is not death, but that he has already lost his son to rage, that Eagle Flies has become a lost soul chasing glory in a war designed for him to lose. Arthur listens, coughing into his sleeve, beginning to understand that this is a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, written on a scale larger than his gang. The Wapiti camp becomes a mirror. Dutch and Eagle Flies on one side, Hosea and Rains fall on the other, idealistic speeches collapsing under the weight of real consequences. The tragic irony is cruel. Rainsfall is the living embodiment of the good Indian the government claims to want: reasonable, peace-seeking, willing to talk when others would fight. Yet the system has no place for him except as a compliant figurehead, a name on a treaty that justifies more theft. His moderation is not rewarded, it is exploited. And so his last gambit as chief is not to win a battle, but to salvage what can still be saved. Not territory, not victory, but lives. As the army tightens its grip and Dutch sharpens his delusions, Rainsfall prepares for one final act, to lead his people not toward triumph, but away from the fire, into whatever future remains after a war he never wanted has finally burned itself out. Rainsfall walks away from the fire. Arthur walks into it. Between those two choices lies one of the most painful turns in the entire story of the Van der Linde gang. From the very beginning of their alliance, Arthur's conversations with Rainsfall are marked by an honesty he rarely grants anyone else. Sitting in the chief's tent, weakened by tuberculosis and worn down by years of blood, Arthur admits the truth that has been gnawing at him. He has done terrible things. He has robbed, killed, and enforced Dutch's philosophy at gunpoint, and now, in his final days, he is simply trying to do a little good before the light goes out. It is not a grand confession shouted to the world. It is a tired outlaw speaking to a man whose world is being taken apart. That confession is more than guilt. It is recognition. Arthur finally sees that by following Dutch from its humble beginnings, by believing in the dream of freedom Dutch sold as resistance, he has helped fan the flames now consuming the Wapiti. He rides with eagle flies to steal the horses, to raid the oil fields, to hit the army convoy, thinking he is helping a people under siege. Instead, each strike gives Colonel Favours the excuse he wants. Each act of defiance lets the army paint the Wapiti as aggressors. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and Arthur realizes he has become an instrument of that change, not its opponent. As that realization hardens, his disillusionment with Dutch shifts from disappointment into a quiet break. Dutch still talks about civilization crushing freedom, about fighting back against a corrupt system, but his actions around the reservation expose the hollowness of that philosophy. He uses the Wapiti as pawns, pushes eagle flies toward war, then abandons him the moment the cost grows too high. Arthur's guilt over the tribe's suffering fuses with his growing sense that Dutch's dreams have curdled into pure delusions. So he begins to act not for profit, not for the gang, but for protection. He escorts Rainsfall, warns him of Dutch's plans, and stands between the army and the Wapiti even when it gains him nothing. There is a brutal irony here. A dying outlaw, responsible for untold deaths, seeks forgiveness from a man whose entire nation is being killed by the same forces that made Arthur who he is. What does redemption mean in the face of that scale of loss? Rainsfall, the living embodiment of a people pushed to the edge of extinction, offers not absolution, but understanding. He sees Arthur as a lost soul, trapped between loyalty and conscience, between the gang that raised him and the people that gang has helped destroy. In the truest sense, Arthur's aid to the Wapiti becomes his clearest attempt at redemption, the one thread of his life where he tries to leave something better behind than the trail of bodies he has created. He cannot save their land. He cannot stop the oil derricks or the treaties or the guns, but he can help Rainsfall lead the survivors away from the killing fields, can buy them a little time and a little distance. And as his own story nears its end, that fragile act of mercy sets up his final choice, whether his last stand will serve Dutch's dying dream or protect what's small. Wounded fragments of family and future still remain. Arthur's promise to help Rainsfall leads not to salvation, but to a final, terrible gamble. The path away from the killing fields bends, for a moment, straight back into the fire. Because Eagle Flies, burning with grief and humiliation, is no longer content to flee. He wants a blow so loud that the whole world will have to hear it. Dutch is ready to give him exactly that. For Dutch, the oil fields are the perfect target, the beating heart of the companies that poisoned the Wapiti land, the excuse Colonel Favours used to starve a nation, the living embodiment of the civilization he claims to despise. He frames the raid as a story of justice and resistance, a decisive strike that will humble both the army and the businessmen who bought it. In truth, from its humble beginnings, the plan is a fantasy stitched from wounded pride and dying dreams. The attack begins in darkness and smoke. The oil derricks loom over the plains like iron trees, groaning and clanking, lanterns swinging from their frames. Then the first explosion tears through the night. A tower of flame roars upward, bathing the battlefield in a hellish orange glow. Men fire from catwalks, and catwalks collapse beneath them. Steam whistles scream, pipes burst, and black crude vomits from ruptured lines, turning the ground into a slick, burning mire. Eagle Flies rides at the front, whooping war cries that cut through the gunfire, charging headlong between the derricks as bullets snap past his horse. His courage is undeniable. His recklessness is fatal. He is, in the truest sense, a lost soul who has decided that dying in the fire is better than suffocating slowly on the reservation. Arthur, coughing, bleeding, tries to turn that frenzy into something survivable, shouting for cover, dragging wounded men behind machinery. firing not to win the war, but to buy one more second for someone to crawl away. Dutch, by contrast, drifts toward the spectacle. He stands where the flames are highest, where the noise is greatest, almost admiring the inferno he helped unleash. This is what he wanted, a vision of the old ways were dying in front of the machines that replaced them, a tableau that proves his philosophy right, even as it kills the people who trusted him. Strategy dissolves into theater, orders become slogans. Who lives and who dies becomes incidental to the image. When the smoke begins to clear, the truth is merciless. Several derricks burn, a few pumps are ruined, some company men and soldiers lie dead among twisted steel. But the field itself still stands, the rails still run. The industrial machine, backed by the state, can rebuild faster than the Wapiti can bury their dead. The raid gives Favours and his superiors exactly what they wanted, proof that the savages and their outlaw allies are a threat that must be erased. What chance does a starving nation have against a government now armed with righteous outrage? In the end, the oil fields burn not as a victory bonfire, but as a funeral pyre. Flames lick the night sky, carrying with them the last illusions that this war was ever winnable on equal terms. And as one body falls in Arthur's arms and Dutch turns away from the cost of his own delusions, the question lingers over the crackling ruins, whose story is really ending here, and whose is about to get much, much darker. In the glow of those burning oil fields, the answer comes in the worst possible way. The story that seemed to be Dutch's grand rebellion suddenly narrows to a single body, bleeding out in Arthur Morgan's arms. Eagle Flies is hit in the chaos of the retreat, a bright, idealistic warrior cut down by a faceless bullet from the very civilization that has been circling his people for years. The charge is over, the gunfire fading, but the real impact lands only when Arthur and Charles drag him clear and Rainsfall stumbles toward them. For a moment, the war, the gang, the entire world falls away. There is only a father, a son, and the outlaw who helped light the fuse. The scene is almost quiet. Eagle Flies gasps for air, blood on his lips, still trying to rise, still trying to fight a battle that is already lost. Arthur, himself coughing, holds him steady, offering the only comfort he can, that the young man's courage meant something. Rainsfall cradles his son's head and speaks in a low, breaking voice, the living embodiment of every warning he has given from the very beginning. This is what he feared. Not glorious resistance, not noble victory, just another child dying in the dirt while the old ways were dying around him. Rainsfall has said, again and again, that war devours the young first and leaves the elders to dig graves. Here, that philosophy stops being a caution and becomes a sentence. His worst prophecy is fulfilled in front of him. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, collapses into a father whispering to a fading son that he is proud, even as he knows pride is a poor shield against bullets and broken treaties. With Eagle Flies' last breath, the Wapiti resistance loses more than a leader. It loses its fire. He was the one willing to ride to Fort Wallace, to raid supply trains, to believe that organized armed struggle could still bend history back toward freedom. Without him, those scattered warriors become a memory instead of a movement. Who will rally starving families now? Who will convince men to pick up rifles when the clearest example of courage ends on a blood-stained hillside beside an oil field? Arthur's reaction is not simple grief. It is grief braided with guilt and a grim determination. He helped push Eagle Flies toward this path, carried along by Dutch's rhetoric and his own desperation to make something right in a world that kept closing in. Now, watching Rainsfall hold his dead son, Arthur understands in the truest sense that there are some wounds no robbery, no speech, no last stand can ever heal. He cannot undo this, but he can at least try to ensure the boy does not die for nothing, escorting Rainsfall away, turning his own failing body into a final shield. In the end, Eagle Flies is not given a national headline, a monument, or a marked grave that travelers will visit. His body is another unrecorded casualty in a conflict the wider world barely acknowledges, one more name erased as the world was changing and the frontier closed. Yet, for Arthur, for Rainsfall, and for those who listen to this story from its humble beginnings to its bitter end, Eagle Flies remains a lost soul whose brief burning life haunts every later silence on the Wapiti Reservation, and whose death marks the point where one possible future for his people is buried forever. Eagle Flies' death leaves a silence on the Wapiti Reservation that speaks louder than any war cry. In that silence, Rain's Fall stands as both father and chief, a man who has lost his son and is now being asked to lose his nation. It is a story of grief held in check, of a leader who knows that one more charge, one more proud stand, will end not in glory, but in erasure. He does not collapse. He does not rage. Instead, he moves through camp with a slow, deliberate composure that makes the devastation around him feel even sharper. The wounded lie under torn canvas, the dead are being prepared for burial, and the smoke of the oil fields hangs on the horizon as a reminder of what this war was really about. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, not in some distant future, but right there in the mud and ash of Wapiti. In private, with Arthur, the mask slips just enough to reveal the depth of the wound. Rain's Fall speaks of Eagleflies not as a martyr, but as a boy who believed, a son pulled between an idealistic dream of resistance and the brutal reality of American expansion. What good is a philosophy of honor, he wonders, if it only feeds more young men into the guns of Colonel Favours and the men who want the oil beneath their feet? Their conversations turn from revenge to escape. Rain's Fall speaks quietly of going north, perhaps to Canada, or further west into lands where the U.S. government's reach is weaker, where a few families might live in the truest sense as themselves, if not as a recognized nation. It is an echo of Arthur's own journey away from Dutch's delusions, away from the fantasy that one last score can fix a world built on betrayal. Yet the decision carries its own cruelty. A chief leading the remnants of his people away from their last recognized territory is, in the living embodiment of irony, both protector and undertaker, he is preserving lives while burying a homeland. They will walk out as refugees in their own ancestral world, leaving behind graves, council fires, and the legal fiction of Wapiti Reservation that was already being carved up for oil. Arthur's role in this final act is not loud, but it is decisive. He rides with Rain's Fall, shields him from patrols, and uses the last of his strength to see the old chief safely onto a train, away from the tightening noose of civilization and the Pinkertons who now hunt everything that does not fit their order. For a man who once robbed trains for Dutch, helping this quiet exodus is a strange, almost ironic inversion of his outlaw life. In helping Rain's Fall escape, Arthur performs one of his last meaningful acts of protection, not for his own family, but for a people who have already lost almost everything. The Wapiti as a sovereign nation are effectively gone, their treaties shredded, their land poisoned, their warriors dead or scattered. Survival, not victory, is all that remains. Some will live on, carrying language, songs, and memory into an indifferent century, but the reservation itself becomes a grave marker for a future that never arrived, and a warning of what this closing frontier truly costs. And as the train pulls away, one question hangs over the tracks and the empty hills. When a people are forced to abandon their last home, what exactly is left to save? That question lingers in the air long after the train is gone, and the only honest way to answer it is to go back. Back to the hills. Back to the dust. Back to the Wapiti Reservation when the gun smoke has cleared and the story missions are over, to see what remains when a nation has been pushed past the edge of the map. Returning late in the game, or in the epilogue, the player finds no new quest marker, no fresh confrontation, no renewed promise of freedom. The camp that once held starving families and tense councils of war is now a hollow shell, abandoned canvas tents sagging in the wind, fire pits choked with cold ash, cooking racks collapsed beside blackened stones. The world was changing, but here it has simply stopped. The wind still moves. The people are gone. At first glance, it feels almost mundane, just another emptied-out location in a massive open world. But look closer. The details tell a different story. Children's toys lie half-buried in the dirt, a doll's arm reaching out from the dust as if grasping for a hand that will never return. Simple cooking tools rest where they were last used, a pot overturned beside a crate, bowls scattered around a dead fire that never got its final meal. Ceremonial items, feathers, beads, carved pieces of bone, hang from poles or lie trampled in the mud, the living embodiment of a culture forced to leave even its sacred objects behind. This is a story of absence, of the space where a people used to be. From its humble beginnings as a background location on the map, the reservation becomes, in the truest sense, a crime scene that the game never tapes off. The environmental storytelling makes one thing painfully clear. The Wapiti did not pack up and move on in comfort. They fled. They were driven. The old ways were dying, and there was no time to gather heirlooms when soldiers and rifles closed in on every horizon. Emotionally, that emptiness hits harder than another shootout ever could. Many places in Red Dead Redemption 2 reset or repopulate over time, bandit hideouts refill, towns rebuild, strangers reappear as if the world's wounds can always be stitched over. Wapiti never does. It remains a scar on the landscape, a wound that refuses to heal, a quiet contradiction of the comforting illusion that this outlaw playground will endlessly refresh itself for more adventure. Compared to other evolving locations, the rebuilding streets of Valentine after a drunken brawl, the shifting camps of the Vanderlinde gang, even the changing ranches around Blackwater, the reservation's evolution is devastating precisely because it moves in one direction only, towards silence. No replacement NPCs, no new economy, no second chance, just an echo, just a gap. In that choice, Rockstar denies the player the neat closure that most game stories chase. There is no final cutscene where the Wapiti reclaim their land. No epilogue mission where civilization apologizes and makes amends. Their dreams do not resolve, they simply vanish from view, leaving only objects and absence behind. And that raises a harder question, one the next part of this story must confront. If the game refuses to bury this loss, what other ghosts are still walking its frontier? Those ghosts are easy to miss. In a story of train robberies, bank heists, and Pinkerton ambushes, the quiet ruin of an entire nation can vanish between one camp move and the next, hidden in corners of the map that the main tale never demands. From the very beginning, the game trains attention on the Vanderlinde gang's survival, not on the Wapitis. The formal introduction to Rainsfall and Eagleflies in Saint Denis is technically optional, a strand that can be delayed or ignored by anyone racing toward the looming bank job. Arthur's visits to the reservation, his rides with Charles to deliver medicine, even the mission where he helps Rainsfall retrieve sacred items from an army wagon, all sit at the edge of the main outlaw path. The gang's world is burning, and the player can simply keep chasing Dutch's next plan, never turning aside to see who is already living in the ashes. The design makes that detour fragile. There is no giant shimmering marker dragging the camera toward the reservation, no forced march through Wapiti territory during a main camp relocation. A rider can gallop from Valentine to Annisburg 100 times, following debt collections and robberies, and never once angle west into the dry valley where the Wapiti tents sag in the wind. Even the pivotal factory raid with Eagleflies, which escalates the conflict with Colonel Favours, can feel like one more chaotic skirmish in a long line of Dutch's delusions, rather than the culmination of a slow engineered starvation. Why bury something this large? Why let a central tragedy sit behind side paths and quiet conversations? In the truest sense, that choice mirrors the world that created Wapiti in the first place. In American history, indigenous suffering is pushed to margins, footnotes, and background scenery behind tales of progress and civilization. Rockstar builds that erasure into the structure of play itself. The reservation is present, persistent, and mostly unmarked, the living embodiment of a people forced out of the story even as they stand in the middle of it. On second playthroughs, many players begin to notice the gap. Some only learn the full arc from lore videos and detailed breakdowns, realizing that Colonel Favours' withheld rations, the oil fields, and Eaglefly's radicalization are not just flavor, but a complete political tragedy, from its humble beginnings in broken treaties to its bloody conclusion on the battlefield. Comment sections fill with confessions. The first run was a blur of shootouts. The second revealed Rainsfall's letters, the abandoned dogs at Wapiti, the way Arthur's own illness echoes a nation being slowly suffocated. Seen from that angle, the reservation stops being a side area and becomes a moral center of the frontier. It is where Dutch's philosophy is exposed, where Arthur's loyalty is tested, where the old ways were dying long before the gang realized the world was changing. The next part of this story must stay there longer, not to redeem the loss, but to understand what kind of freedom is being bought, and at whose expense. To see the Wapiti Reservation clearly is to realize that this is not just game drama, but a story of how a nation was carved up on paper long before a single shot was fired in the valley. From its humble beginnings, the United States built an entire legal machine to turn indigenous homelands into real estate, and the Wapiti are the living embodiment of that machine at work. The very beginning of that process can be traced to laws like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of eastern nations to lands further west. On the surface, it promised treaties, compensation, even protection. In practice, it meant death marches, broken agreements, and a brutal message: land mattered more than lives. As the frontier pushed outward and the world was changing, removal hardened into the reservation system, a network of controlled spaces meant to confine peoples whose freedom stood in the way of civilization. By the late 19th century, even those reservations were treated as temporary obstacles. The Dawes Act of 1887 took communal lands and sliced them into individual allotments, selling the surplus to settlers and corporations. It was, in the truest sense, legal dispossession. What happens to the Wapiti mirrors this pattern beat for beat. A series of treaties narrows their territory, the army pushes them onto barren ground, and industrial interests close in on the oil beneath their feet. Colonel Favours' cruelty is not an aberration, it is policy in uniform. His decision to withhold rations and medicine until rains fall submits echoes real-world tactics, where agents starved reservations to force signatures on new agreements. The promise of food becomes a weapon, the threat of hunger a bargaining chip. When the Wapiti are told to move again, to make room for the wells, it recalls countless relocations to lands no one else wanted. Places already stripped of game, timber, and water. Even the conflict over that oil field stands in a long line of resource wars. In the real 19th century, railroads cut through treaty lands, mines tore open sacred mountains, and later, oil fields rose on stolen ground. Nations fought surveyors, sabotaged tracks, and resisted drilling, only to face soldiers, Pinkertons, and private guards. Is it any surprise that Eaglefly's rage feels familiar, or that Rainsfall's exhausted diplomacy sounds like the voice of a man who has watched the same betrayal play out for decades? The Wapiti, then, are fictional, but their story is a composite, a story of loyalty to land, of betrayal by law, of dreams of coexistence crushed by profit. They stand in for countless communities whose names never appear in the game, yet whose histories shape every frame. Understanding that context does more than add trivia, it deepens the wound. The reservation stops being a backdrop for an outlaw tragedy and becomes commentary on the death of a world, on how the old ways were dying under the weight of a new civilization that called this progress. And, in the next part of this story, that knowledge will make every choice around Wapiti feel heavier, because the cost is no longer abstract. That weight is not only carried in bullets and bayonets, it lingers in coughs, in empty pots, in the quiet of a camp where too many voices have gone silent. The Wapiti Reservation is a story of conquest told through hunger and disease, the living embodiment of how a nation can kill without ever pulling a trigger in front of witnesses. From the very beginning of Arthur's involvement, sickness sits in the frame. The so-called vaccine mission, where the gang hijacks a wagon of medicine, exposes the cruel irony at work. Life-saving supplies are moving through a world where the people who need them most are deliberately kept from them. When Arthur rides into Wapiti, he does not find a camp preparing for war. He finds people doubled over by coughing fits, elders too weak to stand, children with the glassy stare of fever. The camera lingers, and the player is forced to see what the state prefers to ignore. Historically, this is not an accident, and the game knows it. Across the real frontier, overcrowded reservations, contaminated water, and rotting rations turned epidemics into a predictable harvest. Tuberculosis, measles, smallpox, they did not arrive as random tragedy, but as the logical outcome of policy. When a population is driven from fertile valleys to barren rock, when hunting grounds are fenced off and food shipments are late or spoiled, disease stops being misfortune and becomes administration. Colonel Favours embodies that philosophy in the truest sense. He withholds food, delays medical care, and uses scarcity as leverage, all to clear the land for oil and appease industrial allies. In Red Dead Redemption 2, the army is not shown handing out infected blankets, yet its behavior is no less lethal. Promised aid is dangled, then denied. Doctors do not arrive. The camp grows thinner, weaker, more desperate. Is there any moral difference between firing into a crowd and calmly refusing the medicine that would have kept that crowd alive? The game makes this cruelty intimate by tying it to Arthur himself. His tuberculosis becomes a parallel track, running alongside the Wapiti's illnesses. Every time he stumbles, every time a coughing fit cuts off his dialogue, the player is reminded that disease is not abstract. NPCs remark on how sick the Indians look, on how the reservation ain't right, while background animations show men resting against tents, women moving slowly, children barely playing. Weak idle cycles, ragged breathing, and offhand lines keep the sense that something is rotting under the surface of this new civilization. From its humble beginnings as a frontier epic, the story widens into an indictment. Bullets are only one way to erase a people. Starvation leaves no muzzle flash, smallpox leaves no arrest record. It is quieter, easier to deny, easier to call unfortunate. And as the pressure around Wapiti builds, as hunger and fever harden into rage, the next choice Arthur faces will show whether this slow violence can be escaped or whether it is already too late. But there is another kind of assault tightening around Wapiti, one that leaves no bodies on the ground and still feels, in the truest sense, like a killing. It is the quiet stripping of meaning, the taking of objects, stories, and sacred ground until a people's past can be boxed, labeled, and hauled away. From the very beginning of Arthur's involvement, the game seeds this other violence. In Archaeology for Beginners, he rides with Rainsfall to recover ceremonial items seized by the army. To Colonel Favours' men, these are curiosities, trophies, proof that the old ways were dying and that civilization is marching on schedule. They are shoved into wagons, stacked in tents, passed between bored soldiers who do not even know what they are holding. The camera lingers on that indifference, a medicine bundle tossed beside a crate of ammunition, a carved pipe resting on a bale of hay. To the army, it is all the same, inventory. But to the Wapiti, these are not trinkets. They are the living embodiment of ancestry and obligation, a story of loyalty between the living and the dead. A pipe belongs to a lineage, a feathered headdress carries prayers, a bundle of herbs and bones is meant to guard the camp from misfortune. When those things vanish, protection vanishes with them. The mission makes this contrast painfully clear. Arthur lifts each object carefully, almost reverently, mirroring Rainsfall's deliberate movements. The player is made to slow down, to hold a button, to watch hands close around something fragile. Then the scene cuts back to the fort, where the same artifacts are dumped in piles, half covered in dust. Respect and contempt, preservation and plunder, shown in the space of a few steps. And this is not an isolated theft. Earlier, collectors approached the gang with offers for Indian curios, eager to buy anything torn from graves or abandoned villages. The irony is sharp. Outlaws who rob banks for freedom now find themselves ferrying stolen memory for gentlemen who will lock it behind glass. Who is the real criminal in that exchange? Outside the game's world, the pattern is painfully familiar. For more than a century, museums and universities in the United States and beyond built collections on the same philosophy Favours embodies, that indigenous bodies and sacred items were raw material for science, display, and national myth. Skulls measured to prove racist theories, grave goods dug up for dioramas, ceremonial pipes and medicine bundles tagged with accession numbers and removed from the communities that knew how to care for them. What happens when a people's dead are cataloged, when their prayers become exhibits? It is an attack not just on land and bodies, but on continuity itself. The Wapiti story, from its humble beginnings in hidden valleys to the bleak reservation by the oil fields, is a story of systematic unmaking, of territory, of health, of faith, of memory. The theft of those sacred objects signals the deepest betrayal of all, an attempt to ensure that even if some Wapiti survive, the world will forget what they once were. And as the conflict escalates, that erasure will not stay confined to tents and wagons. It will spill onto the battlefield, into policy, into the stories civilization tells about its own progress. Erasing a people's memory is one thing, erasing the witnesses is another. Standing between those two kinds of destruction is a man who once believed his only family rode under a black and white banner that said Van der Linde. From the very beginning, Arthur Morgan's identity is fused to Dutch's campfire philosophy. Dutch rescues him as a boy, teaches him to read, to shoot, to question civilization's laws. The gang becomes his world, in the truest sense, a roaming household of misfits where loyalty replaces blood and robbery is framed as resistance. For decades, Arthur is the living embodiment of Dutch's dream of freedom, the enforcer who keeps the family fed and the doubters quiet. But by the time the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, that family is poisoning itself. Dutch's speeches grow harsher, his plans more desperate, his paranoia sharper. He trusts Micah over Hosea's memory, abandons John, and treats every setback as betrayal rather than consequence. Camp, once noisy with children and music, becomes a damp cave of arguments and whispered fears. The old ways were dying, but Dutch cannot admit that his own delusions are helping kill them. Then Arthur rides north and sees another kind of camp. The Wapiti Reservation is starving, diseased, stripped of its sacred objects, yet the people move with a quiet dignity that unsettles him. Women share what little food remains. Warriors help elders walk. Rain's fall tends to both bodies and spirits, apologizing when his son's anger spills over, pleading for calm even as the army chokes off supplies. In a world built on extraction and betrayal, this broken village still clings to communal care. At first, Arthur's help is just another job. Dutch wants leverage over the army and the oil interests. Rainsfall wants stolen horses and documents returned. Arthur rides that line, stealing for Dutch while promising aid to the chief. But each mission forces a choice. Follow Dutch's order to escalate, or honor Rainsfall's plea to spare lives. Encourage Eagle Flies' rage, or echo the old man's weary wisdom. Every time Arthur sides with restraint, a crack appears in his old loyalty. The turning points are small, but relentless. He warns Rainsfall about Dutch's schemes. He risks Dutch's anger by riding with Charles to rescue captured Wapiti. He delivers messages, medicine, and apologies that Dutch never sends. Helping the Wapiti lets Arthur imagine a different kind of loyalty, one grounded not in shared crime, but in protection, responsibility, and the stubborn defense of a people who have almost nothing left to lose. In that contrast, Arthur finally sees what Dutch has become. Not a savior of lost souls, but another man willing to sacrifice a nation for one more score. His time among the Wapiti begins to break Dutch's spell, to pull Arthur out of the role of obedient outlaw son. But the realization comes late. Too late for the gang, already rotting from within. Too late for the Wapiti, already marked for removal. And as those two doomed families collide, the cost of Arthur's divided heart will only grow. From that collision of doomed families emerges the cruelest question of all. If the Wapiti see what is happening, why do they not simply fight and win? The game invites that instinct, then carefully dismantles it, showing a story of resistance crushed not by cowardice, but by the weight of an entire civilization bearing down. On one side stands the United States Army, the living embodiment of industrial war. Rifles, artillery, repeating carbines, Gatling guns mounted on fort walls, supply wagons that never stop rolling, telegraph wires that can summon reinforcements from miles away, trains that move troops faster than any horse can run. On the other side stands a small, starving nation penned on barren rock, hunting thin deer in a valley whose best land has already been fenced, drilled, and surveyed. A handful of old muskets, a few stolen Springfields, and courage. Courage does not reload faster than a Gatling gun. From its humble beginnings, the Wapiti struggle is framed inside a political world where their voices do not carry. Rainsfall writes letters that vanish into filing cabinets. He travels to the city, speaks to officials, begs for medicine and food that Colonel Favours has already decided to withhold. There is no newspaper eager to print Wapiti testimony, no court that will meaningfully punish an officer for starving an entire people. On paper, treaties exist. In practice, those treaties are a suggestion, and the only signature that matters is the one on the next oil lease. Because under everything, there is money. The reservation sits beside oil fields and railroad dreams, a junction where black gold and steel rails promise fortunes to men who will never see the reservation except as a problem to be cleared. Favours is not just a petty tyrant, he is an employee of progress, rewarded for turning empty land into profit. When powerful investors, politicians, and industrialists are all staring at the same map and seeing dollar signs, what chance does one peaceful chief have of negotiating a compromise that leaves his people truly free? The game communicates this imbalance with quiet, merciless precision. Even when Eagle Flies strikes the oil fields, even when Arthur helps raid a fort and the player watches soldiers fall, the victory feels thin, almost hollow. Within a mission or two, more troops arrive, more wagons roll. The world was changing, and every success is treated by the machinery of empire as a brief inconvenience, not a turning point. The old ways were dying, and the gunfire only seems to speed their burial. In the truest sense, the Wapiti do fight back, through petitions, through ambushes, through desperate last charges in the snow. Their failure is not a failure of bravery, strategy, or loyalty, but the predictable outcome of a war whose rules were written to erase them before the first shot was fired. The real question is not why they could not win. It is what that rigged war will do to Arthur Morgan when he finally understands it, and what he chooses to do next. When the credits roll on Arthur Morgan's life, the war for the Wapiti seems finished. But the land remembers. In the epilogue, as John Marston rides through the familiar canyons and wind-carved ridges around the old reservation, the player walks through the aftermath of a story of conquest that the game now treats as background scenery. The first thing that stands out is absence. The Wapiti camp is abandoned, its lodges collapsed or stripped, fires long dead. The oil derricks in the valley below still claw at the earth, and the rail lines and telegraph poles continue their march. Quiet proof that the Indian troubles have been solved in the truest sense that the government understands, not by justice, but by removal. The world was changing, and on this land, that change has already been finalized. NPCs in towns and on trains now speak of those troubles in the past tense, when they mention them at all. A newspaper line about the Army's success, or a passing remark that the reservation has been pacified, frames the Wapiti's erasure as a completed task, an administrative checkbox. There are no new petitions, no new speeches from Rains Fall, no more delegations riding to Annisburg. The bureaucracy of civilization has moved on, and the reservation is treated as a solved problem rather than a wound. This is where John Marston's story enters, almost ironically. From its humble beginnings on a rundown ranch at Beecher's Hope, his epilogue arc is about building a home, chasing a quieter dream of freedom inside the fences that Arthur once tried to push against. John is not asked to choose sides in a tribal war. That war has already been decided by Colonel Favours and men like him. John simply lives in the world their philosophy created. Every fence post John hammers, every debt he pays, takes place on a frontier already carved up by the same forces that starved the Wapiti. His conflicts are with landowners, loan sharks, and government agents who assume their right to rule is unquestionable. Is it any wonder that the outlaw who once believed in Dutch's grand speeches now spends his days doing honest work on stolen land, under a sky that once echoed with Eaglefly's last charge? There is a quiet, haunting irony here. John inherits Arthur's journal, Arthur's lessons, Arthur's regret. He knows what Arthur tried to do for the Wapiti, and he knows how little it changed the larger trajectory of the region. That knowledge does not grant him the power to rewind history. It only deepens the sense that the old ways were dying long before Dutch's gang fell apart, and that even the most idealistic resistance can be buried under railroads and ledgers. In the end, the reservation exists in the epilogue as a ghost, a place without people, a battlefield without a monument. Its empty lodges and silent hills remind the player that the world of Red Dead is built on layers of unseen loss, and that the van der Linde gang's tragedy rests atop another nation's disappearance, a foundation of betrayal that the game never lets fully fade, even when almost everyone has stopped speaking its name. The silence around Wapiti is not an accident of the world, it is a verdict. In a land obsessed with legend, the reservation becomes the one place that refuses to turn its dead into heroes or its suffering into spectacle. Across the map, the outlaw myth never stops talking. Dutch's speeches echo in campfires and saloons, his name whispered as a curse and a promise. Old gunslingers trade stories of shootouts at high noon, of trains robbed and posses outsmarted, of men who stood alone against the march of civilization. Newspapers splash their faces on front pages, dime novels turn their robberies into epics, and even their betrayals become part of a story of freedom, family, and doomed idealistic dreams. The van der Linde gang is treated as the living embodiment of a certain fantasy, that one lost soul with a gun can hold back the world. By contrast, the Wapiti resistance barely exists in the public record. No campfire tales recount Rains Fall's attempts to save his people through diplomacy. No songs are sung about Eagleflies, who dies charging a federal fort in the truest sense of sacrifice. The same world that cannot stop talking about outlaws falls almost completely silent about a nation fighting for its own survival. Why does a bank robbery become legend, while a people's dispossession becomes background noise? The answer lies in who owns the printing presses, who writes the official histories, Who decides which blood is remembered and which is quietly washed away? In this story of the dying frontier, power shapes memory as ruthlessly as it seizes land. The newspapers that sensationalize Dutch's latest crime are the same institutions that parrot Colonel Favours' language about order and progress. The dime novels that glorify gunfights are funded by the same civilization that wants the Wapiti gone to clear the oil fields. So when the Wapiti appear in those papers, it is only as Indian uprisings, troubles, or disturbances near the reservation. Short phrases, buried paragraphs, dismissive footnotes. A raid on a military convoy becomes savagery. Systematic starvation, broken treaties, and state violence vanish behind a single vague sentence. From its humble beginnings, the official record is designed not to explain what happened, but to make questioning it seem unnecessary. Rockstar leans into that erasure. The game world's myth-making machinery is loud for outlaws and almost mute for indigenous resistance, and that imbalance is deliberate. In a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, the Wapiti are denied even the twisted honor of being turned into villains. They are pushed to the margins, their tragedy present but rarely named, mirroring how real indigenous histories are minimized. Distorted or reduced to the old ways we're dying as if that were a natural law rather than a deliberate policy. Yet the ruins remain. The player's footsteps through those empty lodges create a different kind of archive, one made of attention rather than headlines. By lingering there, by tracing the path from treaty to reservation to battlefield, this video positions itself as part of an alternative memory, a story that refuses to let the Wapiti vanish into the silence that conquered them, and that turns a forgotten reservation into a central chapter in the myth of the West. If memory is an invisible archive, then the Wapiti Reservation is its most haunting exhibit, because this place tells a story of betrayal and slow erasure without a single spoken word. From its humble beginnings as a temporary camp to its final state as a half-abandoned scar in the hills, the reservation is framed as a character in the truest sense, wounded, exhausted, and still, somehow. Enduring, the layout comes first. Teepees cluster tightly around a thin, reluctant stream, the only real water source in a landscape that feels deliberately stripped bare. There is no grand river, no fertile valley, only a trickle that forces the entire community to huddle inward, as if the camp itself is bracing against the world. The oil fields sit at a cruel distance, close enough that the drilling towers loom on the horizon, far enough that the Wapiti gain no benefit, only the noise and the smoke. And there are almost no fortifications, no palisade, no earthworks, just a few token watch points on the rocks. For a people surrounded by an army that withholds food and medicine, this absence of defenses is not an oversight. It is the living embodiment of enforced vulnerability. Color and light deepen that vulnerability into a constant mood. Scenes at Wapiti are painted in muted browns, grays, and washed-out greens, as if the land itself has been drained. Overcast skies hang low, flattening the horizon and robbing the camp of warmth or grandeur. When the sun does appear, it is often a cold, hard light, emphasizing sharp cheekbones, tired eyes, and the thinness of the horses. Freedom here is not romantic. It is bare survival under a pale sky. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the palette never lets that be forgotten. Then there are the details that speak in whispers. Makeshift graves sit on a rise above the camp, marked by simple stones and wooden crosses, suggesting not one tragedy but a long sequence of quiet deaths from disease and hunger. Abandoned tools, axes left in stumps, broken wagons, scattered crates, hint at interrupted labor, at projects started with idealistic hope and then abandoned when the rations failed to arrive. Worn paths cut the dust between teepees, the fire pit, and the medicine tent, their depth revealing how long the Wapiti have walked the same few yards, circling a life that never expands. In contrast, other camps in this world almost feel arrogant. The Vander Linde hideouts at Horseshoe Overlook or Clemens Point are draped in canvas awnings, lantern light, and the easy sprawl of people who still believe in their dreams. Prosperous ranches boast painted houses, fenced pastures, and barns that speak of security and surplus. Wapiti has none of that. No fences to keep danger out, because danger already owns the horizon. No surplus, because even the firewood piles feel meager. Struggling between freedom and civilization, the reservation becomes a lost soul among settlements. Even if every cutscene were skipped, The art direction alone would still reveal a story of slow, grinding tragedy, a camp pressed against a dying creek, shadowed by oil towers, surrounded by graves. The question is not whether this place is doomed. The question is what will happen when that doom finally arrives on horseback and in uniform, and who will still be standing in the dust when it passes through. That doom does not arrive all at once. It arrives in choices. Small gestures at first, then larger commitments, until the player is forced to confront how much control truly exists in a world already carved up by railroads, rifles, and oil derricks. From the very beginning of the Wapiti arc, the game offers a story of agency inside a cage. Arthur can choose whether to ride with Rain's Fall to collect the sacred items stolen by the army, whether to return the stolen horses, whether to help steal the vaccine, whether to follow Charles into the reservation again and again. In camp, there is the option to linger, to listen, to bring provisions, to read Arthur's own evolving thoughts in his journal, or to rush through, to treat each mission as just another marker on the map. The design quietly judges those decisions without ever breaking character. Help Rain's Fall with care, and his gratitude is subdued but deep, the living embodiment of dignity under pressure. Ignore side paths, and certain conversations never happen, certain reflections never appear, leaving Arthur's inner life thinner, more mechanical. NPCs notice if the player rides respectfully through the tents or tramples fires and pathways. The reactions are small, a muttered curse, a wary glance, but they accumulate into a sense that this camp is watching. Civilization may have written the Wapiti off, yet this space still demands respect. Arthur's journal becomes the clearest mirror. When he takes time to aid the tribe, his entries grow more contemplative, more openly ashamed of Dutch's philosophy and of his own outlaw past. When he does the bare minimum, those pages are sparser, the regret less articulated, as if even on paper he is dodging the truth. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and the player's level of engagement determines how fully Arthur understands that tragedy in the truest sense. There is a cruel tension at the heart of these missions. Every act of kindness hints at the fantasy that the Wapiti might be saved, that enough stolen medicine or enough stolen documents could outmaneuver Colonel Favours and the men behind him. Yet the narrative refuses that comfort. No matter how thoroughly objectives are completed, Eagle Fly still falls, Rain's Fall still walks away into exile, and the reservation still rots under the shadow of the oil towers. What does heroism mean when the outcome cannot be changed? Some players lean into that inevitability, role-playing Arthur as fully devoted to the Wapiti cause, visiting the camp between missions, riding slowly through the valley as if it were hallowed ground. Others treat the questline as one thread among many, a detour between robberies and family drama. The game allows both readings, yet places them side by side, a quiet binary contrast between an idealistic attempt at loyalty and a pragmatic focus on survival. In the end, that unease is the point. The Wapiti arc refuses the comforting illusion that every injustice can be fixed by a single gun or a single good man. It asks for care without promise of victory, compassion without reward, a pattern that will echo, soon in Arthur's own fate, and in the final unraveling of Dutch's dream of freedom. That demand for compassion without reward runs into something colder at Wapiti, a man who does not see a tragedy at all. Colonel Henry Favours stands on the edge of this dying nation and tells himself he is saving it. That is what makes him dangerous. From the very beginning, his presence in cutscenes feels different from the game's more theatrical villains. He does not rant, he does not cackle, he does not revel in blood. He moves with the slow, bored precision of a clerk, not a conqueror, arranging papers on his desk while Rain's Fall pleads for food and medicine. His voice is calm, his posture relaxed, his expression almost weary. In the truest sense, he is the living embodiment of routine power, a man who signs orders that starve a people, then complains about the paperwork. Listen to the words he chooses when Arthur and Dutch cross his path. Favours talks about maintaining order, about discouraging unrest, about ensuring progress for the region. He insists that supplies must be withheld because aid would encourage dependency, that resistance must be crushed because discipline is the only language these wards of the state understand. His philosophy is not framed in hatred, but in duty. What is a little hunger, he implies, compared to the march of civilization and the promise of oil beneath the soil? In his mind, the Wapiti are not a nation, not a family, not a story of survival against impossible odds. They are a problem to be managed, a column in a ledger, an obstacle between the federal government and industrial capital. When he orders patrols to fire on starving men who dare to cut down government trees, he does not see murder. He sees a correction. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, and in his eyes, the Wapiti simply refused to keep up. That quiet dehumanization is what allows him to stand in a pristine blue coat while children waste away under his jurisdiction. He never asks if they deserve better. He only asks if their presence disrupts his reports. In that, he echoes real officers who enforced broken treaties, real agents who funneled rotten rations to reservations, real bureaucrats who sat in Washington and called it policy when entire cultures were being erased. How many of them told themselves, as Favours does, that they were serving the greater good? This is not the operatic evil of an outlaw gunning down rivals in the street. It is something colder and far more common. Favours shows how ordinary functionaries, with tidy uniforms and tidy desks, become instruments of genocide simply by doing their jobs and refusing to see the people in front of them. And if such a man can exist here, in this story of outlaws and fading frontiers, what does that say about the wider world beyond the Van der Linde gang's fall? Soon, the consequences of his order will explode into open war. Soon, that order collides with something far older than any ledger or uniform, the quiet labor of the Wapiti women, holding together a nation that the world is determined to tear apart. From the very beginning of Arthur's visits to the reservation, they are there on the edges of the frame. Women bent over thin cooking fires, stretching meager rations into meals that can feed a camp. Young mothers rocking infants in makeshift cradles. Elders seated near the tipis, grinding herbs, murmuring prayers, tending the sick when medicine from the fort mysteriously never arrives. It is a story of survival carried out in silence, in the truest sense of background work that keeps everything else from collapsing. Their roles are practical and spiritual at once. They prepare what little food the army allows through, sew and repair clothes against the brutal northern winds, and keep rituals alive with songs and offerings that the player can glimpse but never fully enter. When disease spreads through the camp, it is often a woman at a bedside, damp cloth in hand, while Rainsfall argues with distant officials and Eagle Flies plans raids in the hills. The men carry the visible burden of leadership in war, the women carry the invisible burden of continuity. Rockstar stages this with deliberate restraint. The camera rarely lingers on them, yet their presence is constant, the living embodiment of what is truly at stake. Snatches of dialogue reveal their inner world. A mother worries aloud that her son will follow Eagle Flies and never return. An elder questions whether the spirits can forgive Rainsfall's compromises, even as she admits that open war will only bring more graves. Another woman, watching soldiers ride past, wonders if civilization means anything but hunger. In those lines, the grand philosophy of freedom and progress shrinks down to a simple question. Will the children survive the winter? Their fears mirror the fracture between Rainsfall and Eagle Flies. Some women speak with aching respect for the chief's patience, insisting that keeping the people alive is the only victory left. Others, especially the younger ones who have already lost brothers and husbands, quietly echo Eagle Fly's fury, asking how long loyalty to broken treaties can be called wisdom. Between resignation and rage, between dreams of peace and the delusions of negotiation, they stand and keep cooking, keep nursing, keep praying. This is not accidental. It reflects a long, brutal reality beyond the game's borders. In indigenous communities across North America, when men were killed, imprisoned, or forced into wars not of their choosing, women became the last line of defense for family, land, and memory. They hid children during removals, preserved languages and whispered stories, and held ceremonies in secret when the old ways were dying under the pressure of boarding schools and missionaries. The Wapiti women echo that history, even if the camera rarely grants them center stage. And so, in a game obsessed with outlaws and fathers and sons, their quiet labor deepens the tragedy. If this reservation falls, it is not only warriors and leaders who are lost, but the cooks at the fires, the elders with the herbs, the mothers who still believe, against all evidence, that some fragment of their world can be saved. The question is, when Dutch and Eagle Flies drag the Wapiti into open war, what happens to the people those women are trying so desperately to protect? The answer comes in a small, almost quiet detail: the children. In the truest sense, they are the living embodiment of what the Wapiti are fighting to hold on to, and what this world is determined to erase. Walk through the camp carefully, and they are there on the edges of the frame. Never centered, never named, present. A girl tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. A boy clinging to his mother's dress as she argues with a soldier. A cluster of little ones coughing near a fire that has more smoke than warmth. Their presence changes everything. The reservation is no longer only a story of warriors and treaties, of Dutch's philosophy colliding with Rainsfall's restraint. It becomes a story of bedtime songs sung in a language the state intends to outlaw, of games played under watchtowers, of childhood unfolding in the shadow of rifles and oil derricks. The old ways were dying, and the children are the ones forced to live in the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Starvation and disease hang over them first. Colonel Favours' decision to withhold food and medicine is not just cruelty toward a faceless population. It is a death sentence aimed at the smallest bodies in the camp. Malnutrition stunts growth. Weak lungs collapse under winter air. Minor fevers become killers. When the army locks up the medical supplies, it is not simply a tactical move in some abstract negotiation with rain's fall. It is a calculated bet that hunger will silence mothers before bullets have to. History makes that bet legible. From its humble beginnings, federal Indian policy in this era pushed children to the front lines of assimilation. So what waits for the Wapiti children who survived the raids, the coughing, the long hungry nights? Boarding schools, almost certainly. Haircut short, clothes burned, new names assigned. Their language beaten out of them in classrooms far from the mountains they once ran through. Freedom traded for a uniform, family traded for an institution, dreams traded for discipline. The game never shows those schools. There is no cutscene of a Wapiti boy forced to recite English prayers, no shot of a girl punished for speaking to her sister in her own tongue. Yet the wider history of this civilization makes those images impossible to ignore. The reservation, the broken treaties, the interest in oil, the talk of civilizing and progress all point in one direction. The player is left to connect the dots, and those dots form a bleak outline. Later, when the reservation is revisited and the tipists stand empty, the silence hits harder because of those earlier glimpses. The missing children haunt the space. Not just the warriors who died, not just the elders who vanished, but an entire next generation carved out of the story. The world was changing, and in that emptiness, the absence of their footsteps is the loudest sound of all. That emptiness is not an accident. It is a design choice, and in the truest sense, it is a mirror. From the very beginning, the Wapiti story is placed where most riders will never stop for long. The reservation sits off the main arteries of the map, away from the glamorous train robberies and stagecoach ambushes. The player can thunder past on a fast horse, chasing dreams of outlaw glory, and never truly see the hunger, the sickness, the missing children. That blindness is the point. It reflects a civilization that only glances at indigenous suffering when it becomes impossible to ignore. Who stops for a starving camp when there is a bank to rob in Saint Denis? By making so much of the Wapiti's tragedy technically optional, Rockstar builds a quiet accusation into the world, a story of loyalty and betrayal, of freedom and civilization, of dreams and delusions is hiding in plain sight, waiting for those who move slowly enough to notice. The game rewards the player who wanders off the road, who reads letters in abandoned teepees, who listens to Rainsfall's weary philosophy by the fire. In a world where the old ways were dying, the act of simply paying attention becomes a kind of moral test. This approach also fits Red Dead Redemption 2's broader design, where immersion is the living embodiment of its themes. The same slow, deliberate pacing that lets Arthur skin an animal, brew coffee, or sit and talk with his makeshift family is what allows the Wapiti story to unfold as more than a quest marker. A player who camps near the reservation, returns after key missions, or explores the oil fields on foot sees the noose tightening, the soldiers' patrols, the poisoned water, the way the land itself is being carved up for profit. Including this subject at all in a blockbuster game was a risk. The Wapiti arc touches on genocide, forced relocation, and state-sanctioned theft. Handled carelessly, it could have become a grotesque spectacle, a background tragedy used only to make the outlaws feel heroic. By hiding it slightly, by refusing to shout about it in every cutscene, Rockstar avoids turning real historical trauma into a carnival attraction. The horror is there, but it has to be sought out, pieced together, respected. For those who do uncover it, the Wapiti Reservation becomes a secret history woven through the main plot. Each return visit feels heavier, each conversation with Rinsfall and Eagle flies more loaded, because the player has walked among the ruins and read the records of broken treaties. It deepens the world's moral complexity, turning the Van der Linde downfall into only one thread in a much larger tapestry of loss. In that light, the reservation stands as one of the clearest signs that this is not just a Western power fantasy. It is a critique of the myths the genre usually celebrates, a reminder that behind every legend of freedom lies a nation pushed to the margins, and a camp that someone chose not to see. From that ruined camp, the story widens. The Wapiti Reservation is not just a tragic endpoint, it is a bridge between eras, a scar that runs straight from the late 1800s of Red Dead Redemption 2 into the early 1900s world of the first game, where the frontier is closing and the machine age is no longer creeping but roaring. By 1899, when Arthur Morgan rides through that valley, the world was changing in ways that no speech from Dutch, no plea from Rain's Fall, can truly stop. Railroads carve the land, telegraphs stitch distant towns together, oil rigs pump in the shadow of sacred hills. Within a single generation, the Wild West is being folded into a national grid of industry, profit, and law. The old ways were dying, and those who lived by them are already being written into the past tense. In that sense, the disappearance of the Wapiti is a grim preview of the more sanitized, law and order West that John Marston inhabits years later. By 1911, when his story unfolds, indigenous presence has been pushed to the margins, mentioned in passing, hinted at in ruins and place names, but rarely seen in the flesh. Towns stand where camps once stood. Ranches fence in what were once communal hunting grounds. The reservation that was supposed to be a compromise becomes, in the truest sense, a holding pen on the way to erasure. Yet the landscapes John crosses are not neutral. They are the living embodiment of earlier acts of dispossession, even when the game does not pause to lecture on them. A lonely grave on a hill, an abandoned campfire ring, a derelict mission or fort, each is a quiet echo of stories that ended before John's begins. The oil fields near the old Wapiti lands, the rail spurs cutting through canyons, the fenced pastures and tidy main streets, all stand on foundations laid by people who were promised freedom and given treaties instead, promised protection and given soldiers. Here, the Van der Linde gang and the Wapiti tribe become parallel lines in the same tragic design. Both are held together by a fragile philosophy of resistance. Both are led by men who believe, from the very beginning, that they can outtalk or outfight the march of civilization. And both discover that the new order being built has no place for idealistic outlaws or sovereign nations that refuse to disappear on schedule. Dutch's camp and Rainsfall's camp tell the same story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family trying to survive as the ground shifts beneath them. One ends in a hail of bullets and a cliffside fall. The other ends in wagons leaving a poisoned valley, faces turned toward an unknown horizon. To truly understand Red Dead's world, the Wapiti Reservation has to be seen not as background, but as one of its foundational tragedies, a story of what had to be broken, so that John Marston's West could exist at all. The question is, who else was broken along the way? Whose ruins are still hiding in plain sight, waiting to be found in the next stretch of road? Those ruins are not neutral. They look back. They ask what it means to turn another people's catastrophe into a mission marker, a backdrop for an outlaw's redemption, a story of one man's awakening while an entire nation is being erased. From the very beginning, the Wapiti arc makes some players uneasy, and that unease is not a flaw in the experience so much as a measure of its honesty. This is a world where freedom for Dutch's gang is bought with stolen land, where dreams of escaping civilization rest on ground taken from those who had no say. Feeling that tension, feeling that discomfort when Arthur rides into a starving camp, can be the point. It is the friction between power and powerlessness made playable. There is a difference between using atrocity as decoration and treating it as the living embodiment of a broken philosophy. Many games gesture at historical horror, then turn it into spectacle, a dramatic set piece, a villain's monologue, and nothing more. Red Dead Redemption 2 takes a slower, more somber road. The Wapiti are not there to hand out magical wisdom or comic relief. They are exhausted, sick, arguing among themselves, caught between Rainsfall's weary pragmatism and Eaglefly's desperate rage. The tragedy is not just what happens in cutscenes, it is the quiet space between them. Interactivity changes everything. This is not a film where events unfold at a safe distance. The player chooses whether Arthur lingers to listen to Rainsfall's stories, whether he rides past the reservation after the main mission's end, whether he returns with medicine, or simply treats the place as another completed quest. Does Arthur loot the dead after the ambush at Beaver Hollow, or stand in silence among the bodies? Those small optional gestures do not rewrite the plot, but they reveal who this outlaw has become, and what the audience is willing to overlook. That power to choose brings responsibility, not only for the character, but for the creators. Rockstar shoulders part of that burden with care. The Wapiti are voiced by indigenous actors, their dialogue rejects the noble, savage cliché, and their suffering is explicitly tied to treaties, oil, and the machinery of the state. Yet the game still centers a white outlaw's arc, still lets the reservation fade once Arthur's journey ends. The old ways were dying, and the camera follows the man riding away rather than those left in the dust. In the truest sense, engaging with the Wapiti story is an invitation to look past that camera, to see this not only as content consumed, but as an echo of real reservations, real broken promises, real lost soul communities pushed to the margins so that another legend could be born. Thoughtful attention becomes a small act of respect. The question then is not just what happened to the Wapiti, but how this understanding reshapes every campfire tale about freedom, family, and the cost of civilization still to come. Fan attention does something the game's own world refuses to do. It lingers. Where the camera pulls away, players stay, walking the ruined campfires and empty lodges until background scenery becomes a story of absence, of names without quests, and graves without cutscenes. In the truest sense, the Wapiti Reservation only becomes fully visible once the credits threaten to roll. From its humble beginnings as a one-off visit on Arthur's errand, the area has been mapped, cataloged, and almost archaeologically excavated by the community. Minor Wapiti NPCs who barely speak in the main missions have been tracked as they move between the reservation, Valentine, and Annisburg, suggesting quiet attempts to trade, to work, to simply survive at the edge of civilization. Players have matched specific graves to those faces, reading worn carvings and beadwork to infer family bonds, lost children, and warriors who never returned from Favours' ambushes. A single child's toy left beside a headstone has launched entire threads about who that child was, and whether that family ever made it out. Environmental clues deepen those imagined biographies. A broken crate of government rations near the burned wagons, hints that promised food arrived only as bait. Medicine bottles scattered in the chief's tent suggest a long, losing fight against disease before the bullets ever started flying. Even the way the oil derricks loom in the distance has been read as deliberate framing, the living embodiment of industry watching a nation die. This attention naturally spills into the unanswered question that haunts the epilogue. Where did Rains fall and the survivors go after leaving Wapiti behind? Some players trace their path north, noting dialogue about moving toward Canada and connecting it to remote cabins, abandoned camps, and distant smoke columns that never trigger missions. Others argue they slipped south and west, toward New Austin, pointing to faint references in newspaper articles and overheard bar conversations about Indians heading for the border. Neither trail is confirmed, but both transform the map into a canvas of possible futures rather than a static backdrop. Data miners have pushed even further, uncovering traces of cut dialogue and mission markers that suggest a more extensive Wapiti arc once existed. Fragmentary lines hint at additional negotiations with Favours, a planned relocation escort, even a sequence where Arthur could visit a second temporary camp after the reservation assault. The absence of these scenes in the final game has only intensified the sense that another layer of this tragedy lies just out of reach. Into that gap step fan artists, writers, and lore creators, building an oral tradition the game's world denies. Fan art imagines Rain's fall in old age, teaching children far from the oil fields. Fanfiction follows a handful of survivors across the mountains, struggling between dreams of freedom and the realities of a closing frontier. Long-form videos stitch together every scrap of dialogue, every carved symbol, turning scattered details into a coherent chronicle. It becomes, in its own way, a story of loyalty to characters the narrative abandons. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, But the question remains, what else has been missed in those quiet corners of the map? In the comments, every overlooked grave, every stray line of dialogue, every theory about where the Wapiti went can become part of a shared archive, a collective effort to ensure their story does not vanish into the background once more. In that silence around the reservation, the Wapiti become more than side characters. They become a mirror. Their story is a story of what Arthur was, what he is becoming, and what he will never be able to undo. From the very beginning of their involvement, Arthur does not ride into Wapiti territory as a savior. He arrives as an errand boy for Dutch's philosophy, suspicious of Rain's fall, impatient with diplomatic talk, focused on leverage rather than justice, helping steal back horses, escorting the chief to collect evidence against Colonel Favours, even tailing government agents through the rain-soaked streets of Saint Denis. At first, each mission is another job, another angle, another way to keep the gang's dreams alive. But something shifts. As Arthur's cough worsens and his world narrows, his perspective widens. The trip to the oil fields, watching Wapiti men beaten and arrested to clear land for civilization and profit, lands differently on a man who has spent years telling himself that robbery is a blow for freedom. The contrast is brutal. Earlier in his life, Arthur could burn a homestead, shake down a farmer, or threaten a witness with a shrug. Violence was work. Consequences were distant. On the reservation, starvation and disease are not abstractions. They are children begging for food, elders lying in filthy tents, a nation reduced to rations that never arrive. In that setting, Arthur's empathy stops being an occasional impulse and becomes a guiding force. His conversations with Rain's fall are the living embodiment of his moral transformation. The old chief speaks of dead sons, broken treaties, and the futility of answering betrayal with more blood. Arthur, for once, listens more than he talks. He admits his regrets, confesses that he has done bad things, and wonders aloud whether a man can leave something good behind when his whole life has been defined by the gun. It is not Dutch or Hosea who finally forces him to articulate this. It is a leader who has every reason to hate outlaws and still chooses mercy. As Eagle flies is drawn toward war and Dutch happily fans the flames, Arthur's role changes from reluctant helper to committed ally. He risks himself to rescue Eagle flies from the fort, to shield the retreating Wapiti during the chaotic river battle, to oppose Dutch directly when the chief's pleas for peace are ignored. Without the Wapiti, his redemption would rest only on fractured loyalties within the gang, on protecting John's family and defying Micah. Important but personal. The Wapiti give him a cause that is, in the truest sense, clearly just. By the end, the old ways were dying, and Arthur finally understands what that really means. It is not only the outlaw way that is ending, it is entire peoples being erased while men like Dutch call themselves revolutionaries. The Wapiti become his moral compass and his verdict. He cannot save their nation, but he can refuse to look away. And that refusal sets up a final choice that will define him forever, a choice that waits just beyond the next gunfight. That choice does not only measure Arthur. It measures the player watching him. The Wapiti Reservation becomes a mirror, and in that reflection stands every decision taken in this world, every instinct that guided the reins and the trigger finger from the very beginning. How was this place first met? Was it a blur on the horizon while racing toward another mission marker, a forgotten cluster of tents passed on the way to loot a nearby cabin? Was attention fixed on the oil fields and their promise of money and mayhem? Or did the rider slow the horse, dismount, and actually walk through the camp, listening to the coughing, seeing the empty food crates, noticing the way Rain's fall stands apart in quiet defeat? That first encounter is a story of priorities, of what the game seemed to offer, and what the player chose to see. There is always a powerful temptation in games to chase power, progress, and completion. More guns, more upgrades, more perfect pelts, the endless march toward a full compendium and a cleared map. In that rhythm, suffering becomes scenery, a backdrop to another outlaw fantasy. The Wapiti arc resists that impulse in the truest sense. It slows the pace with long rides beside an aging chief, with missions where the only reward is carrying a sick man or stealing back poisoned supplies. It asks whether freedom is measured in gold and dead Pinkertons, or in the simple act of refusing to treat these people as numbers on a ledger of objectives. Background shapes the way this land is read. For some, the reservation is a shocking revelation, an unexpected plunge into historical cruelty in a world they thought was only about train robberies and shootouts. For others, especially those who know the history of broken treaties, stolen nations, and children taken to distant schools, the Wapiti are not a twist. They are the living embodiment of a pattern already burned into memory. The old ways were dying long before Dutch ever picked up a gun. The game simply lets that truth stand in the snow, starving and proud. When anger rises at Colonel Favours, when sadness settles in watching eagle flies fall, when helplessness gnaws because no button prompt can rewrite this fate, that is not a failure of design. That is the intended wound. A story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, must hurt to mean anything. The reservation is built to be lost, and that loss is meant to linger. The harder question waits beyond the controller. How often does the modern rider pass real reservations, forgotten neighborhoods, or poisoned rivers without stopping, without asking who was pushed there so that civilization could grow somewhere else? The Wapiti Reservation ends within the game's borders, but the pattern it reflects rides on, just over the next hill. From there, the camera can pull back. The Wapiti Reservation is not only a wound in this digital landscape, it is a bridge between a fictional frontier and the very real history of colonization that shaped the modern world. In the truest sense, it becomes a classroom made of rock, dust, and broken promises, where a story of freedom and betrayal can be turned into questions instead of just spectacle. Teachers, critics, and parents have already begun treating it that way. In lesson plans shared online, some history teachers assign the Wapiti missions alongside readings on the Dawes Act and the Indian boarding school system, asking students to compare Rainsfall's quiet desperation with real leaders forced to sign away land. Media critics use Dutch's grand speeches about civilization and progress to open discussions on how governments framed indigenous nations as obstacles rather than partners. Parents report watching their children ride through the reservation, then pausing the game to talk about why the tents are torn, why the water is poisoned, why the soldiers never bring food. From its humble beginnings as a subplot inside an outlaw western, the Wapiti arc has pushed many players beyond the screen. Comment sections and forum threads are filled with people admitting that this was the very beginning of their curiosity about real tribes. Some describe finishing Eaglefly's final ride, then searching for information on the Lakota, the Cheyenne, or the Nez Perce. Others mention discovering historians such as Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, or reading D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee because Rainsfall felt too human to be only a character. That spark can be guided. Educators point toward documentaries on the Standing Rock protests, or films by indigenous directors that tell a story of resistance from the inside rather than through an outlaw's gaze. Indigenous creators on YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok have produced critiques and playthroughs where they pause the game to explain what Rockstar gets right, what it flattens, and what it leaves out. In those spaces, the Wapiti become a mirror, not a substitute, for living communities still fighting pipelines, jurisdictional theft, and the slow violence of poverty. Yet a commercial video game has limits. It must remain entertaining, legible, and centered on Arthur's journey, which means indigenous people risk becoming the living embodiment of tragedy that exists to deepen a white protagonist's moral awakening. The world was changing, the old ways were dying, but the camera still follows the outlaw, not the nation being dismantled. That tension matters, and good teaching names it. Even so, the potential for historical empathy is real. When a player rides through the reservation after the final battle and finds only wind and ashes, that absence can be turned into a question. Whose stories are still missing here? In classrooms, living rooms, and online communities, the Wapiti Reservation stops being just a tragic backdrop and becomes a starting spark, pushing the conversation beyond Rockstar's map and into the history that inspired it. So return, for a moment, to the valley itself. Before names and treaties, before missions and markers on a map, the Wapiti camp stands as a quiet basin in the mountains, a story of land and memory pressed into one narrow stretch of earth. The first approach comes from the high trail, hooves crunching on loose stone, wind pulling at coats and manes. The sound of the world falls away as the path narrows, and then the reservation opens beneath the cliff. Hide tents in a rough circle, thin smoke rising into cold air, a few horses tethered near the edge of the creek. From its humble beginnings in the player's journey, it feels less like a destination and more like stumbling into a place that was there long before the very beginning of Arthur's crisis. The descent into camp passes the chief's tent first, the largest lodge set slightly apart, not in arrogance, but in responsibility. Here Rainsfall steps forward, the living embodiment of a philosophy that refuses to give up dignity even when civilization has stripped everything else away. Around him, elders sit on low stools, children linger near the doorway, and the wind carries the low murmur of a language this new American world is trying to erase. The story of freedom and family is already under siege before a single shot is fired. A little farther on, near the sparse line of trees, the graves wait. Simple mounds, wooden markers, a few tokens pressed into the soil. Disease, hunger, neglect. Each name on those boards speaks to treaties broken in distant offices and orders signed by men who never saw this valley. It is a place of silence, but not peace. Who is mourned here, and who will never even receive a marker? Past the center circle, the cooking fires burn low, more smoke than flame. Women stir thin stews, men repair worn saddles and cracked rifles. Elders watch the horizon where the oil fields poison the distance. It is a camp in motion yet going nowhere, trapped between the cliffs and the army's ledgers, between idealistic promises and deliberate betrayal. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but here that change looks less like progress and more like slow starvation. As missions unfold, the camp shifts. Wounded warriors return from raids. Eaglefly strides through the tents with fire in his eyes. Soldiers' bullets and Dutch's delusions both leave their mark. More graves appear, more tents sag empty. The same path through the valley, walked days later, feels heavier, every footstep echoing with choices that cannot be undone. And then, at last, the valley is empty. No fires, no voices, just the wind, the creek, the circle of trampled earth where a nation once tried to endure. In the truest sense, it becomes a pilgrimage site within the game's world, a place where an outlaw's story intersects with an older, deeper wound. Who rides through now and does not feel the absence press against the ribs? Stay there, in imagination, at dusk. The sky bruises purple over the ridges, the last light catches on abandoned poles and prayer ties, and the sound of the river swallows every distant gunshot memory. The camera lingers, refusing to cut away, holding that valley in a long, unbroken gaze. Because the next step in this story will not just revisit what happened here, it will ask why it had to happen at all. The camera's refusal to look away matters, because the Wapiti Reservation is not just a location, it is the living embodiment of the game's central argument. This is a story of freedom promised, freedom constrained, and freedom rewritten into paperwork and barbed wire. From its humble beginnings as a quiet valley, it becomes a courtroom with no judge, where treaties, ledgers, and military orders pass sentence on an entire people. The contrasts that define the Wapiti are the same contrasts tearing the Van der Linde gang apart. On one side stands Wapiti tradition, communal land, ritual, a philosophy of balance with the land that raised them. On the other stands industrial progress, surveyors, derricks, and Colonel Favours reports about development and security. The world was changing, and the old ways were dying, but not by accident or fate. They were being strangled under the language of civilization. The reservation exposes how hollow that civilization truly is. Laws and treaties, in theory, exist to recognize rights. In practice, every document shown or mentioned around Wapiti is a weapon. Favours withholds food that is legally owed, delays medical supplies that are already paid for, and invokes regulations to justify starving families. What does freedom mean when the only legal path is obedience to a system designed to erase a nation? Rainsfall understands that system in the truest sense. His leadership is peaceful, patient, painfully pragmatic. He pleads, negotiates, and endures humiliation to keep his people alive. Eagle flies, watching disease and hunger spread through the camp, becomes the lost soul of a generation that refuses to die quietly. Their conflict mirrors Dutch and Arthur, an idealistic father clinging to a philosophy of restraint, and a furious son who believes only action can break the cage. Yet the game is merciless in showing that both paths are crushed by the same machine. Dutch's fantasy of an outlaw utopia collapses under Pinkerton guns and corporate money. The Wapiti's hope for survival collapses under the same alliance, only wrapped in flags and legal seals. One is chased from banks and city streets, the other from ancestral mountains. but the authors of their destruction share an address. That is why the reservation becomes a moral anchor for the entire narrative. Every time the player rides past those thin tents and coughing children, the beauty of the West is forced to share the frame with the cost of that beauty. The sunsets, the rivers, the herds of elk across the ridge. How many buried stories lie under each postcard perfect scene? In the end, the Wapiti are not background lore or a tragic side quest. They are one of the clearest answers to what Red Dead Redemption is really about. A world where freedom is preached. Civilization is celebrated, and entire peoples are sacrificed so the myth can live. And as the gang's story reaches its final act, that myth is about to demand one last, terrible payment. In the end, the myth takes its payment and moves on. The land does not. Long after Arthur is gone, after the gang is scattered to prison yards and unmarked graves, the Wapiti Valley remains, holding the silence of everything that happened there. Imagine it years after the game's final gunshot. The campfires are long cold, their circles of ash swallowed by new grass. The tents have rotted back into the soil, leaving only faint rings where families once slept. The oil derricks still stand, but their gears have seized, their ladders have collapsed, and rust blooms across the metal like a slow disease. Wind moves through the valley where voices once argued about freedom and survival, and no one remembers the names Rains Fall, Eagle Flies, or Arthur Morgan. Not here. Not out loud. This is a story of absence as much as presence, of what is left unsaid once the last chapter closes. The reservation, from its humble beginnings as a promise on paper, has become a quiet graveyard for dreams and delusions. The old ways were dying long before the player ever rode into that canyon. By the time the credits roll, they are ghosts in the grass, glimpsed only if someone chooses to stop, to look, to listen. The world was changing, and the Wapiti were written into that change as a footnote. Yet the story does not end inside the game's borders. It continues in the memories of those who carry the Wapiti with them, in late-night thoughts about a sick outlaw delivering medicine to starving children, or a weary chief picking flowers for his wife while soldiers plan his people's removal. In the truest sense, the reservation becomes a haunted place in the mind, a living embodiment of what progress costs when civilization insists it is benevolent. Here the fiction brushes against history, and the distance between them almost disappears. The broken treaties that shape the Wapiti echo real agreements signed and discarded. The polluted river that poisons their horses mirrors real watersheds choked by mines and pipelines. Even now, indigenous nations fight in courts and on backroads for land, for water, for the simple recognition that their story did not end when someone else declared it over. The names are different, the uniforms have changed, but the philosophy of extraction and erasure is painfully familiar. That is the quiet power of Wapiti. Not as a side quest, but as a story of loyalty and betrayal, of freedom promised and revoked, of family torn between survival and resistance. It lingers. It complicates. It makes the heroic frontier feel less clean, less comforting, harder to accept as pure legend. If a single fictional valley can feel this heavy, what does that say about the real valleys beneath real pipelines? So the camera pulls back from the rusted rigs and overgrown trails. The ghosts remain where they fell. The next step, as the credits fade and the myth of the West settles back into place, belongs to whoever has been listening. So the camera pulls back, and the Wapiti story resolves into a single, painful line. A people pushed from their birthright to a scarred valley beside an oil field. From its humble beginnings in the high, cold country, this was a story of treaties signed under pressure, promises broken in back rooms, and a proud nation herded into a holding pen that existed only to clear the way for drilling. From the very beginning, the Wapiti are already in retreat. Their ancestral hunting grounds are carved up by surveyors, their rivers measured in barrels and profit, not in seasons and migration. Each new agreement with the government takes more land and gives less in return, until the final relocation strands them on barren rock, staring across the creek at machines chewing into the earth. The reservation is not a refuge. It is the living embodiment of a philosophy that sees land and people as resources to be spent. Inside that cage, the tribe fractures along a single, agonizing question: how to survive a world that has decided it no longer has room for them. Rainsfall bends toward peace, toward patience, toward keeping as many children alive as possible under Colonel Favours' boot. Eagle Flies burns for action, for dignity, for a war that might at least prove they were not cowards. Between father and son, between caution and fury, the tribe's choices are pulled in two directions until something has to snap. Into that tension rides Arthur Morgan, an outlaw with lungs full of blood and a conscience waking up too late. He helps recover the Wapiti's stolen sacred artifacts from the museum in St. Denis, not just as a job, but as a faint echo of respect in a world that has forgotten what that word means. He steals vaccines meant to be withheld, rides to rescue eagle flies from a doomed raid, and finally stands shoulder to shoulder with Wapiti warriors as Favours' men close in. In the truest sense, a dying man becomes the last shield for a dying nation. The story races toward its bloody peak. The fort assault exposes Favours' corruption but invites brutal retaliation. The oil fields battle turns industrial ground into a killing floor, where Eagle Flies is mortally wounded while dragging Arthur to safety. His death shatters Rain's fall, shames Dutch, and signals that the old ways were dying not in ceremony, but in gunsmoke and mud. The Wapiti's final departure from the reservation, led by a grieving chief under Arthur's protection, is not a victory march. It is an evacuation. Taken together, their journey threads through Red Dead Redemption as a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of freedom promised and then revoked in the name of progress. The world was changing, civilization marching forward on rails and pipelines, and the cost is written in the erasure of nations like the Wapiti. How many lives, how many lost soul histories, are buried beneath the towns and tracks the player rides through without a second thought? That question, more than any gunfight, is the wound this reservation leaves behind. That wound does not close when the credits roll. It lingers, quiet but insistent, in every empty tent, every cold fire pit, every broken crate on that plateau. The Wapiti Reservation is not just a backdrop for Arthur's illness or Dutch's final delusions. It is the living embodiment of what the American West cost in the truest sense. So the ride is not over. The story only feels complete when the player turns back toward that canyon and enters it again, not as a gunslinger on a mission, but as a witness retracing the path of a lost soul nation. What changes when the same ground is crossed with the knowledge of who slept in those bedrolls, who prayed in those circles, who died in that mud? A second visit transforms set dressing into evidence. On that return, small details begin to speak. The children's toys left beside collapsed shelters, the medicine bundles abandoned in the rush to flee, the proximity of the drilling rigs humming just beyond the ridgeline. Each becomes a line in a story of loyalty and betrayal, of dreams and delusions, of family pushed to the edge so that civilization can congratulate itself on progress. Even a lone horse tied to an empty post feels accusatory, as if waiting for riders who will never come home. That is where this saga can become more than a game narrative. The comment section beneath this tale can turn into its own campfire, a place where different players share the moments that broke them, the details they noticed, the questions they still carry. Who lingered with Rain's fall by the river? Who rode back after the final missions just to see what remained? Who realized, only on a later playthrough, that the reservation was already dying from the very beginning? From its humble beginnings as a fictional nation on a digital map, the Wapiti story points outward, toward real homelands and real treaties. Beyond the screen, the next ride can lead toward learning the names of indigenous nations whose lands are now called by other names, seeking out their own histories, their own rains, falls, and eagle flies. It can mean supporting indigenous writers, historians, and creators who have been telling this story long before any studio rendered it in polygons. Because in the end, this has always been more than an outlaw tragedy. Wapiti stands at the center of Red Dead's philosophy, the quiet counterpoint to every train robbery and shootout, the reminder that the old ways were dying not by accident but by design. The world was changing, and the cost was measured in languages silenced, rivers poisoned, and camps left to rot in the shadow of oil derricks. So the ride continues, but more slowly now. A lone rider moves through Wapiti at sunset, hooves muffled in the dust, the sky burning gold over empty lodges and wind-torn banners. Nothing attacks, no mission triggers, no music swells. There is only the sound of the wind, the memory of what once stood here, and the knowledge that this story of erasure is not confined to one game or one map. For staying through this entire journey, through every rise and fall, every broken promise and quiet grave, This tale offers only one final request. Remember this place. Carry it into the larger world. And the next time the sun sets over that hollow camp, let it fall on a rider who finally understands what those empty tents once held.